Long before the kingdom of Kush emerged, the narrow ribbon of the Nile carved out one of the most strategically valuable landscapes in northeastern Africa, a corridor whose geography would determine every stage of Nubian history. The origins of Kush cannot be understood without first examining the physical environment that shaped all early societies of the Middle Nile. Between the first and sixth cataracts lies a landscape defined by sharp environmental contrasts. A narrow floodplain surrounded by arid desert expanses, pockets of mineral-rich terrain, and natural choke points that turn geography into a decisive historical force. This corridor, stretching roughly 1,200 kilometers, created the ecological foundation on which early Nubian cultures formed during the 4th and 3rd millennia BCE. Archaeological surveys confirm that settlements consistently clustered along this strip, where agriculture, mobility, and resource extraction converged in ways that favored social complexity. The Nile's annual inundation was central to these developments. Records of flood patterns preserved in later Nilometers, though mostly Egyptian, help model earlier behaviors along the Middle Nile. The floods deposited nutrient-rich silt on the valley floor, permitting cereal cultivation, small-scale irrigation, and localized population growth. In Lower Nubia, especially between the 2nd and 3rd cataracts, the valley is notably constricted. In many places, the arable zone measures only a few hundred meters across. This forced early communities into tightly organized settlement strips, intensifying interaction and competition for land. Further south, toward the 4th cataract and beyond, wider floodplains created more dispersed occupation zones, including early sites at Kerma and Sai that would later develop into major cultural centers. The deserts flanking the Nile added another layer of importance. To the east lay the rugged hills of the Eastern Desert and access routes to the Red Sea. To the west stretched the Bayuda Desert, whose wadis provided intermittent pasture and caravan corridors. Both regions contained vital mineral deposits. Gold-bearing quartz veins in the Eastern Desert are attested by hundreds of ancient mining pits, some dated by archaeological analysis to late prehistoric and early dynastic phases. This natural wealth became a defining feature of Nubia and later Kush, influencing trade relations with Egypt and contributing to the region's long-term economic significance. The cataracts, rocky rapids that interrupt the Nile's navigability, played a dual historical role. On one hand, they served as natural defenses. On the other, they created interregional barriers that required technological adaptation and logistical planning. The first cataract formed a boundary between Egypt and Nubia, referenced in early Egyptian inscriptions dating to the late pre-dynastic period. Further south, the 2nd through 6th cataracts divided the Middle Nile into distinct ecological compartments. These divisions encouraged localized cultural diversity but also stimulated interaction as communities moved goods and people across each zone's limits. Archaeologists have documented trade items, including obsidian from Ethiopia, shell from the Red Sea, and early copper artifacts, that reveal long-distance circuits crossing these natural boundaries well before the rise of Kush. Early Nubian groups such as the A group, circa 3800 to 3100 BCE, illustrate how the environment structured social behavior. Excavations at Kustal, Balana, and other lower Nubian cemeteries show that early elites controlled trade passing between Egypt and the Middle Nile. The distribution of imported goods, including Egyptian palettes, faience beads, and copper tools, indicates a specialized role as intermediaries. This exchange was not one-directional. Nubian pottery styles, particularly black-topped wares, appear in pre-dynastic Egyptian sites, showing cultural diffusion in both societies. This evidence demonstrates that geography did not isolate early Nubian communities. Instead, it created predictable routes along which goods, technologies, and ideas circulated. In Upper Nubia, especially around the later Kerma region, the environment supported a different developmental trajectory. The wider alluvial plains near the Dongola Reach provided more agricultural land, allowing emerging communities to support larger populations and increasingly complex social structures. Archaeologists at Sai Island and Kerma have uncovered large habitation zones with storage pits, cattle remains, and early fortifications. Cattle pastoralism was particularly prominent in this region, as reflected in rock art documented at sites throughout the Eastern Desert and the Third Cataract Zone. These images show long-horned cattle in herding scenes, offering insight into early subsistence practices shaped by the semi-arid climate. Climatic reconstructions based on Paleolake deposits and pollen analyses indicate that the 4th to 3rd millennia BCE were transitional periods marked by declining rainfall following the end of the African humid period. As the Sahara dried, populations moved toward the Nile, contributing to demographic consolidation in the valley. This process is observable in the stratigraphy of early settlements, which show increasing density and more permanent architectural features over time. The convergence of groups with diverse mobile traditions, pastoralists, fisher hunters, and early agriculturalists, accelerated cultural synthesis. This environmental pressure, therefore, contributed directly to the emergence of regional cultural identities that would eventually evolve into the distinct polities of Nubia and later the Kingdom of Kush. Trade routes further connected this landscape to wider networks. The Middle Nile was embedded within a north-south axis linking Egypt to sub-Saharan Africa and an east-west axis extending into the deserts and the Red Sea. Excavations at Sai and other Upper Nubian sites have produced carnelian beads, marine shell, and exotic stone tools that originated far beyond the Nile corridor. These finds show that early Nubian societies adapted their mobility strategies to the environmental conditions, navigating desert wadis and riverine passages to access materials unavailable locally. Their expertise in overland travel would later become a strategic advantage for Kushite states, especially in controlling gold mining zones and desert trade routes. The strategic geography of the Nile corridor also encouraged the development of early leadership structures. The ability to organize labor for irrigation, manage herds, protect trade routes, and negotiate external relations required some form of hierarchical coordination. Evidence from A-group cemeteries, particularly the richly furnished tomb at Kustal, with its incense burner showing iconography resembling early Egyptian kingship, suggests that local elites emerged early in Nubian history. Whether this iconography reflects independent Nubian authority or the adoption of Egyptian motifs remains debated, but in either case it indicates increasing socio-political complexity rooted in environmental management. Interpretively, the geography of the Middle Nile demonstrates three major principles that shaped early Nubian development. First, environmental constraints produced settlement clustering and interconnected communities, fostering both cooperation and competition. Second, resource availability, especially gold and arable land, created incentives for trade and early elite formation. Third, Nubia's position between ecological zones made it a conduit for cross-regional interaction, laying the foundations for the trade networks that Kush would later dominate. By the late 3rd millennium BCE, these environmental and cultural patterns solidified into recognizable regional traditions. The Middle Nile corridor had become a landscape of emerging chiefdoms, interconnected settlements, and specialized economic roles. Archaeological evidence from Kerma, Sai, and the surrounding desert regions shows clear continuity between these early societies and the later political structures that would define Nubian civilization. These environmental foundations created the conditions that allowed the earliest Nubian cultures to develop distinct identities and increasingly complex social structures, patterns that would take clearer form in the rise of the A group, C group, and Kerma traditions. Long before the name Kush appears in texts, archaeological cultures along the Middle Nile were already laying the foundations of Nubian identity. The study of early Nubian civilization begins with the A group, circa 3800 to 3100 BCE, and C group, circa 2400 to 1550 BCE, cultures. Two distinct yet sequential archaeological horizons whose material remains illuminate the social and economic roots of later Kush. These cultures did not form centralized states, but their burial customs, settlement patterns, and everyday technologies show rising complexity that ultimately contributed to the emergence of more hierarchical political structures. Excavations across Lower Nubia, particularly at Kustal, Balana, Annaba, and the cemeteries surrounding the Second Cataract, provide the clearest evidence for how these communities evolved and interacted with their environment and neighbors. The A group represents the earliest well-documented cultural phase in Lower Nubia. Archaeological surveys conducted during the Nubian salvage campaigns of the 1960s identified hundreds of small cemeteries containing round or oval tombs with pottery, stone pallets, beads, and occasional copper items. These objects, combined with evidence of differentiated grave goods, demonstrate early forms of social stratification. Some tombs contain imported Egyptian stone vessels, carved ivory, and beads made from exotic materials, indicating participation in long-distance exchange networks. The distribution of wealth within these cemeteries suggests that specialized elites acted as intermediaries in trade between Nubia, Egypt, and regions farther south. The most widely discussed A-group discoveries come from Custal, where archaeologist Bruce Williams documented a set of elite tombs containing high-status grave goods unlike any previously identified in Lower Nubia. Among these finds is the famous Custal incense burner, decorated with imagery that appears to depict a procession and ruler wearing a crown similar to the white crown of Upper Egypt. This artifact sparked significant scholarly debate regarding the possibility of early Nubian kingship contemporaneous with, or even preceding, early dynastic rulers in Egypt. While the majority of scholars interpret the imagery as evidence of close cultural contact rather than an independent Nubian monarchy, the presence of such iconography is nonetheless significant. It indicates that elite A-group communities were not only adopting Egyptian symbols of authority, but were embedding them within their own funerary practices, highlighting emerging forms of political identity and prestige. Material culture from A-group sites illustrates a society integrated into regional networks. Pottery remains the most diagnostic category. A-group ceramics, such as black-topped red ware and polished bowls, show both local innovation and stylistic influence from Upper Egypt. Their consistent forms and high-quality finishes demonstrate specialized production. In addition, the presence of copper objects, which were not locally produced in large quantities, suggests that A-group communities acquired metals either through trade with Egypt or via intermediary routes leading deeper into northeastern Africa. The control of such routes may explain the concentration of wealth in certain communities, particularly those situated near the Second Cataract. Pastoralism and cattle ownership also played a central role in A-group society. Zooarchaeological analyses demonstrate that cattle, sheep, and goats were central to subsistence and social status. Cattle remains appear frequently in elite A-group tombs, indicating that livestock held symbolic value beyond economic function. Rock art scenes from the surrounding deserts portray cattle with elongated horns, a stylistic tradition later associated with Nubian pastoral symbolism. This continuity suggests that cultural themes rooted in early agricultural and pastoral life later influenced Kushite ritual and state ideology. By around 3100 BCE, A-group culture began to decline. Egyptian sources from the early dynastic period describe military campaigns and expanding control over trade routes extending into Lower Nubia. Archaeological evidence supports this, reflecting a reduction in A-group sites and the appearance of Egyptian outposts near the First and Second Cataracts. This shift marks the conclusion of the A-group cultural horizon and transitions into a more fragmented period before the emergence of the C-group. The C-group culture, emerging around 2400 BCE, developed under different environmental and political conditions. Cross-referencing paleoclimatic data from the Nile Valley shows evidence of decreasing rainfall and increased desertification during this period, forcing communities to rely more heavily on pastoralism and floodplain agriculture. The C-group people established settlements primarily in Lower Nubia, but maintained strong cultural continuity with earlier Nubian traditions. Excavations at cemeteries such as those at Annaba, Dhaka, and Kuban show distinctive burial structures. Round or oval stone-lined tombs covered with low mounds, sometimes surrounded by stone rings. The bodies were often buried in contracted positions, wrapped in leather or textiles. Ceramic styles further distinguish the C-group. Their pottery includes black-topped bowls and distinctive incised geometric patterns, often filled with white pigment. These decorative techniques indicate a well-developed artistic tradition and continuity with A-group black-topped ceramics. The consistency of C-group pottery across a wide region suggests regular interaction among dispersed settlements and possibly shared ritual or social norms. Cattle continued to play an essential symbolic role. Many C-group burials include cattle skulls or horns placed within or near the tombs, a practice that demonstrates continuity with earlier Nubian pastoral symbolism. This ritual focus on cattle appears again in later Kushite practices, particularly in the Napatan and Meroitic periods, when cattle offerings and bovine imagery became central to state ideology and royal ceremony. The persistence of this symbolism over millennia highlights a long-term cultural thread linking pre-state societies to later political formations. The C-group existed alongside increasing Egyptian expansion into Nubia. During Egypt's Old Kingdom and especially the Middle Kingdom, Egyptian rulers sought to secure gold resources, trade routes, and territorial control south of the First Cataract. Textual references from the reigns of Senusret I and Senusret III describe military campaigns and the construction of massive fortresses at sites including Buhen, Mergissa, and Semna. Archaeological excavations at these forts reveal administrative buildings, granaries, temples, and garrisons, indicating a sustained Egyptian presence. The C-group people lived in the shadow of these fortresses, maintaining pastoral and agrarian lifeways while navigating political pressure from the north. Interpretively, the C-group demonstrates a society that maintained its distinct cultural identity despite external influence. Egyptian pottery and goods appear in many C-group settlements, but local traditions remain dominant. Burial patterns, clothing styles, and ritual practices show minimal assimilation during the early phases of Egyptian rule. This resilience contributed to the cultural foundations that later enabled Nubian societies to form independent states once Egyptian control weakened. Social stratification becomes increasingly visible in late C-group cemeteries. Some graves contain more elaborate goods, including faience beads, metal items, and imported Egyptian objects. The presence of elite burials suggests that leadership structures were developing, possibly connected to the management of pastoral resources and mediation with Egyptian authorities. These emerging hierarchies set the stage for the political transformations that followed the decline of Middle Kingdom Egypt. By around 1550 BCE, the C-group culture underwent significant change as the new kingdom expanded aggressively into Nubia. Egyptian conquest integrated Lower Nubia into a colonial administration, leading to the decline of distinct C-group traditions. However, many of their cultural features persisted further south, influencing Upper Nubian societies, especially those near Kerma, which would become the core of early Kushite state formation. Interpretively, the significance of the A-group and C-group lies in three key developments. First, they established enduring cultural patterns, pastoral values, cattle symbolism, and funerary practices that remained central in later Nubian and Kushite identity. Second, they developed early forms of social hierarchy rooted in control of trade, livestock, and interaction with Egypt. Third, their responses to Egyptian expansion, whether through adaptation, resistance, or negotiation, shaped the political conditions from which the Kingdom of Kush would eventually arise. As Egyptian involvement increased, these early communities faced new pressures that would reshape the political landscape of Nubia and contribute to the rise of more centralized power farther south. Egypt's expansion into Nubia transformed local power structures and set the stage for a new state to emerge. Egyptian involvement in Nubia intensified during the Old and Middle Kingdoms, fundamentally reshaping political and economic dynamics in the Middle Nile. While early pre-dynastic contacts were confined largely to trade, by the 3rd millennium BCE Egyptian rulers developed more systematic strategies to obtain resources, secure trade routes, and project military authority south of the First Cataract. This expansion had long-term consequences for local communities and ultimately created the conditions under which an indigenous Nubian kingdom, centered at Kerma, could rise. During the Old Kingdom, circa 2600 to 2180 BCE, Egyptian inscriptions describe expeditions into Lower Nubia seeking gold, incense, ivory, and exotic animals. The autobiographical tomb inscription of Harkhuf, dated to the reign of Pepi II, offers one of the clearest accounts of such missions, detailing journeys to Yam, likely located in the region of modern Sudan. These expeditions required logistical staging points, prompting the construction of small Egyptian outposts near the First Cataract. Although these early installations were modest compared to later fort complexes, they illustrate Egypt's growing strategic interest in the region. Archaeologically, imported Egyptian goods appear in Nubian contexts, indicating that local groups engaged in controlled exchange with Egyptian officials. The collapse of central authority at the end of the Old Kingdom temporarily reduced Egyptian influence, but with the rise of the Middle Kingdom, circa 2055 to 1650 BCE, Egypt pursued a far more assertive policy. Concerned with protecting trade routes and securing access to gold, Middle Kingdom pharaohs established a network of massive fortresses throughout Lower Nubia. These forts, Buhin, Semna, Kama, Asket, and others, formed one of the most sophisticated colonial frontiers in the ancient world. Buhin, located near the Second Cataract, was the largest and most imposing of these structures. Archaeological excavations reveal an extensive fortified town surrounded by massive mud brick walls, towers, and gates. Inside the enclosure, researchers documented barracks, storehouses, workshops, and administrative buildings. Buhin functioned not only as a military base but also as a hub for trade regulation and resource extraction. A temple dedicated to Horus indicates that religion played a role in asserting Egyptian authority over the region. The fort of Semna, built under Senusret III, exemplifies the strategic objectives of the Middle Kingdom. Located at the narrowest point of the Nile between the Second and Third Cataracts, Semna controlled river traffic at a natural choke point. An inscription known as the Semna Dispatch, found near the site, records Egyptian patrols preventing Nubians from moving north without permission. Senusret III's boundary stele, placed near Semna, clearly articulate Egyptian intent to restrict movement and control trade. These records provide direct textual evidence of colonial governance, demonstrating that Egypt sought not merely to extract resources but also to regulate Nubian mobility and political organization. Asket, another key fortress, was built on an island in the Nile, enabling it to monitor both river channels. Excavations show that Asket served as a supply center supporting other fortresses upriver. The distribution of Egyptian ceramics, tools, and administrative tags at the site demonstrates that fort garrisons were integrated into a coordinated military and economic system. The garrisons themselves included soldiers, scribes, craftsmen, and families, revealing that Egypt's presence in Nubia was not limited to short-term campaigns, but involved long-term settlement. Control over gold was central to Egypt's strategy. The Eastern Desert and the region south of the Second Cataract contained some of the richest gold deposits in northeastern Africa. Middle Kingdom inscriptions reference expeditions to mines such as Wadi al-Aki, where mining camps and smelting sites have been identified archaeologically. Gold extracted from Nubia played a significant role in Egyptian state finance, enabling pharaohs to fund construction and maintain administrative networks. As a result, securing these mines required the protection and maintenance of nearby forts. Despite the intensity of Egyptian colonization, local Nubian communities continued to operate within and around this frontier system. Archaeologists working near the fort sites have identified Nubian habitations just outside Egyptian administrative zones. Material findings show mixed cultural assemblages: Nubian pottery alongside Egyptian ceramics, local pastoral tools near imported goods, and evidence of trade taking place even during the height of military control. These mixed materials suggest that the frontier was not a rigid barrier, but a permeable zone characterized by negotiation, adaptation, and occasional conflict. Interpretively, the Middle Kingdom frontier transformed Nubian social landscapes in three major ways. First, Egyptian administrative presence altered regional trade patterns by monopolizing river traffic and redistributing economic power. Second, local leaders who acted as intermediaries between Nubian groups and Egyptian officials gained influence, contributing to the emergence of more hierarchical social structures. Third, the concentration of military installations near the Second Cataract shifted the geopolitical focus southward, where Egyptian authority was weakest. This shift eventually benefited Upper Nubian populations who remained beyond direct Egyptian control. By around 1750 BCE, the Middle Kingdom's authority began to weaken due to internal instability and pressure from Asiatic groups in the delta. As Egypt entered its second intermediate period, its frontier network in Nubia deteriorated. Textual references to fort commanders grow sparse, and archaeological layers show reduced maintenance and eventual abandonment of many fortresses. Without sustained administrative presence, Egypt's grip on Nubia slackened significantly. This withdrawal produced a political vacuum in Lower Nubia, but its effects were even more consequential in Upper Nubia. The absence of Egyptian oversight allowed local populations south of the Second Cataract, centered around Kerma, to expand their political and economic influence. Archaeological evidence from Kerma during this period shows increasing complexity. Elite residential quarters, large funerary tumuli, and extensive workshop areas. These developments point toward the emergence of a centralized indigenous kingdom. With Egypt's withdrawal, a new indigenous kingdom began to consolidate power in Upper Nubia, laying the foundations for what would become the Kingdom of Kerma. At its height, Kerma stood as one of the most powerful kingdoms of the Bronze Age Nile. Between roughly 1700 and 1500 BCE, the kingdom entered what archaeologists call the Classic Kerma period, a phase defined by unprecedented political centralization, monumental building, and material wealth that distinguished it from earlier Nubian societies. Excavations around the massive western Defufa reveal a level of architectural planning and labor organization that signals a state capable of mobilizing large workforces and sustaining them over long construction phases. The Defufa's mudbrick core, ceremonial pathways, and associated temples formed the spiritual and administrative heart of the kingdom, surrounded by storage complexes whose scale indicates intensive state-managed redistribution. Administrative seals, standardized ceramic forms, and evidence of coordinated workshops support the conclusion that Kerma operated with a refined bureaucracy, one that monitored goods, labor, and elite estates. Elite tumuli in the Kerma necropolis further illustrate the hierarchy of this period. Some burials span over 90 meters in diameter and contain hundreds of sacrificed individuals, an unsettling but revealing sign of dynastic authority and ritual power. These tombs also preserve finely crafted objects, black-topped and red-polished ceramics with precise firing control, intricately worked faience, and high-quality goldwork that demonstrates both local skill and access to long-distance trade networks. Kerma's artisans drew on influences from the Sahara, the Levant, and the Red Sea world, transforming imported materials into distinctly Kushite forms. The scale and variety of these goods underscore Kerma's position as a commercial crossroads linking Central Africa, the Nile Valley, and the broader Bronze Age economy. By the mid-2nd millennium BCE, Kerma had developed into a centralized, wealthy kingdom whose political and economic reach extended deep into the surrounding regions. Yet this rising power inevitably collided with Egypt's ambitions to control Nubia's trade routes and resources. Kerma's strength brought it into direct conflict with its northern rival, Egypt. During Egypt's civil war, Kerma briefly gained the upper hand along the Nile. The political fragmentation of the Second Intermediate Period, circa 1650 to 1550 BCE, created a rare window in which the Kushite kingdom could extend its authority northward, influence Egyptian affairs, and forge opportunistic alliances. The most significant of these relationships was Kerma's apparent cooperation with the Hyksos state in the Delta, a partnership shaped not by shared culture but by shared enemies. Both powers benefited from challenging the Theban rulers who sought to reunify Egypt. While no direct treaty survives, circumstantial evidence from Egyptian royal narratives and archaeological patterns strongly indicates coordinated pressure on Thebes from both the north and the south. Texts from Kamos, the last major Theban ruler before Amos I, provide the clearest insight into how threatening Kerma appeared during this period. Kamos' famous stela describes a vile Kushite controlling the region to the south while the Hyksos ruled the north, leaving Thebes caught between two foreign powers. His rhetoric portrays Kerma as a powerful and organized state capable of disrupting trade, raiding Nile settlements, and forming diplomatic ties with Egypt's northern enemies. Although these texts serve propagandistic purposes, they nonetheless confirm that Kerma's military and political presence along Upper Egypt was substantial enough to provoke sustained Theban concern. Archaeology supports this interpretation. Evidence of fortified Egyptian outposts destroyed or abandoned during the period suggests episodes of conflict, possibly tied to Kushite incursions. The presence of Egyptian goods in Kerma, including weaponry and ceremonial items, implies both warfare and exchange, sometimes plunder, sometimes diplomatic gifting. Several Theban campaigns recorded later by Amos I hint that Kerma had seized or influenced territories in Lower Nubia during Egypt's period of weakness, reinforcing the idea of a southern kingdom taking full advantage of a divided Nile Valley. Kerma's strategic position allowed it to pressure Egypt's southern frontier while simultaneously benefiting from trade disruptions. Control over key corridors meant access to gold, cattle, and luxury goods, which further strengthened Kerma's economy and elite authority. For a brief moment in the mid-2nd millennium BCE, Kerma held meaningful leverage over the political fate of Egypt, shaping the broader regional power dynamics of the Bronze Age. Egypt's reunification, however, would dramatically change Kerma's fate. The rise of the new kingdom spelled the end of Kerma's independence. As Egypt reunited under Amos I and consolidated its authority, the Theban kings of the 18th dynasty initiated a systematic campaign to reclaim and dominate Nubia. This process unfolded in stages, beginning with the reoccupation of Lower Nubia and culminating in full-scale military conquest under Thutmose I and Thutmose III. By the mid-2nd millennium BCE, Egyptian expansion transformed the political landscape of the Middle Nile, replacing the once powerful Kerma kingdom with an integrated imperial province governed directly from Thebes. Thutmose I's early reign marks the decisive turning point. Egyptian military accounts describe campaigns deep into Nubia, with royal inscriptions celebrating victories over Kush and depicting the king smiting southern enemies. Archaeological evidence aligns with these claims. Destruction layers at Kerma and associated elite sites indicate violent conflict, burning, and the collapse of local authority. The capital's monumental western Defufa, once a symbol of royal power, shows signs of disturbance during this era, suggesting disruption of ceremonial and administrative functions. Egyptian soldiers and administrators soon followed the armies, establishing strongholds at previously contested centers. As Egypt consolidated its control, it reorganized Nubia into a formal imperial structure. The most important innovation was the office of the Viceroy of Kush, a governor who served as the king's representative, overseeing taxation, military security, diplomacy, and monumental building. Officials such as Thutmose I's Viceroy Amos called themselves King's Son of Kush, reflecting both delegated authority and the symbolic claim that Egypt now parented the southern lands. Their headquarters shifted between major centers, including Annaba, Buhen, and eventually Napata, depending on strategic needs and royal priorities. Egyptian imperial policy combined direct control with cultural assimilation. Temples dedicated to Ammonius and other deities were constructed throughout Nubia, often atop earlier sacred sites. These religious centers functioned as instruments of both worship and administration, reinforcing Egypt's ideological dominance. Egyptian language, art, and burial customs became increasingly visible in local material culture, especially in elite cemeteries where Nubian nobles adopted Egyptian coffins, amulets, and iconography. Yet assimilation was uneven. While elites embraced Egyptian forms to secure favor and status, rural communities continued traditional practices involving cattle symbolism, tumulus burials, and distinctive ceramics. The new kingdom also exploited Nubia's economic resources more efficiently than ever before. Gold from Wadi Alaki and other mines flowed northward, fueling Egypt's wealth and international diplomacy. Large-scale agricultural and pastoral production was reorganized through state-run estates, staffing garrisons, and temple complexes. Trade routes to sub-Saharan Africa were patrolled and taxed by Egyptian officials, granting the empire unprecedented access to exotic goods and foreign tribute. Nubia's prosperity now served the ambitions of an expanding Egyptian empire, which projected its power into the Levant and beyond. Despite this domination, Nubian identity persisted. Beneath the Egyptian administrative layer, Local traditions endured in domestic architecture, pottery styles, ritual practice, and cattle-centered social values. In some regions, especially Upper Nubia beyond the immediate reach of Egyptian garrisons, cultural continuity remained strong. Over generations, mixed families emerged, Nubians who served in Egyptian armies, priests trained in Egyptian temples, and local elites educated in Egyptian scribal traditions. These individuals would later play a crucial role in the reemergence of an independent Nubian polity. By the late New Kingdom, Egypt itself weakened due to internal strife, economic strain, and pressures on its northern frontiers. As central authority declined in the 11th and 10th centuries BCE, imperial control over Nubia loosened. The very systems Egypt had created, administrative centers, temple institutions, and a class of Nubian elites versed in Egyptian statecraft, became the framework upon which a new indigenous kingdom could form. Yet Egyptian rule would not erase Nubian identity. Instead, it laid foundations for a new Kushite state. With Egypt's retreat, Nubian elites gradually reconstructed political authority along the Middle Nile. The collapse of New Kingdom power in the 11th century BCE unfolded over several generations, creating a prolonged period of decentralization rather than a sudden break. As Egypt entered the Third Intermediate Period, shifting between competing dynasties in Thebes, Tanis, and later Libyan-led polities, its ability to maintain garrisons and administrative centers in Nubia diminished. By the time the last Egyptian officials withdrew from Lower and Upper Nubia, the region was no longer an extension of imperial governance, but a patchwork of autonomous communities. These conditions formed the backdrop for a gradual reassertion of indigenous institutions that had persisted beneath centuries of foreign rule. Archaeological evidence demonstrates this transition with clarity. Sites such as Sanam, Tombos, and Kawa show decreasing quantities of Egyptian-style ceramics, imported goods, and administrative seals during the 11th and 10th centuries BCE. Instead, local pottery traditions, including handmade wares with burnished surfaces and distinctive incised decoration, reappear in domestic contexts. Funerary practices also shift. Egyptian coffin styles and amulets decline, replaced by tumulus burials and grave goods reflecting long-standing Nubian preferences, including cattle-related symbolism and personal ornaments made from locally available materials. Such patterns suggest not only the end of sustained Egyptian influence but also a deliberate return to regional cultural norms. This period of reemergence, however, did not immediately produce a unified polity. Rather than a single kingdom rising in the aftermath of Egyptian withdrawal, Nubia in the 11th to 9th centuries BCE consisted of small-scale chiefdoms and influential families who controlled localized resources. These groups likely managed pastoral herds, seasonal agricultural production, and segments of long-distance trade. Their authority rested on kinship networks, control of land and grazing rights, and access to gold-producing regions. The absence of a centralizing imperial force allowed these leaders to expand their influence organically, forming alliances or absorbing neighboring communities. Environmental and strategic factors strengthened the gradual move toward consolidation, particularly around the region of Napata near Jebel Barkal. Located at a natural corridor along the Nile, Napata offered both defensive advantages and economic potential. The surrounding floodplain supported agriculture, while nearby desert routes connected the area to gold mines, pastoral zones, and caravan networks linking the Middle Nile to Central Africa. Even during the height of Egyptian rule, Jebel Barkal had served as a religious center, associated with the cult of Ammonius. Its imposing sandstone pinnacle and temple ruins remained focal points for local ritual memory. As Egyptian power declined, the symbolic prestige of Jebel Barkal became available for appropriation by emerging Nubian leaders seeking legitimacy. Material remains from Napata during this period reflect increasing complexity. Architectural features, including early temple reconstructions and administrative storage spaces, indicate coordinated labor and centralized planning. Ceramic typologies from the 10th to 9th centuries BCE show growing regional uniformity, implying wider trade and cultural integration. At Tombos, inscriptions and mortuary data suggest a mixed population of Egyptians, Nubians, and families of hybrid heritage who gradually assimilated into a localizing Nubian milieu. This blending of cultural traditions provided social flexibility and a pool of literate administrators capable of adapting Egyptian bureaucratic methods to indigenous political aims. Economic factors also encouraged state formation. Renewed gold extraction in Nubian deserts appears to have intensified during this era, with archaeological indicators of mining and processing sites becoming more prominent. Pastoral networks, particularly those linked to cattle herding, expanded as climatic conditions stabilized after earlier fluctuations. Goods moving northward, including ivory, skins, incense, and other high-value items, likely passed through the hands of local elites who controlled strategic choke points along the river. These leaders, benefiting from resource access and trade wealth, had the means to support retinues, maintain ritual centers, and sponsor building projects. By the 9th century BCE, lines of authority began to coalesce around a single dominant center at Napata. The process was slow and iterative, shaped by alliances, marriage ties, economic cooperation, and shared religious devotion rather than conquest alone. As the memory of Egyptian rule faded and new generations grew up within a fully localized environment, a distinct political identity emerged, one that drew on elements of the Egyptian past but was fundamentally rooted in Nubian traditions. As local leaders consolidated power, a new dynastic structure began to emerge at Napata by the 9th century BCE. A recognizable Kushite monarchy had begun to take shape around Napata. The emergence of this ruling class was not the result of a single political event but the culmination of generations of local consolidation across the Middle Nile. As regional elites strengthened their economic bases and forged alliances, a new tier of leadership began to dominate the landscape around Jebel Barkal. Later Kushite inscriptions, particularly those from the reigns of Pi and his successors, recall early figures such as Alara as foundational rulers. Although contemporary records for this period are sparse, the memory preserved in later texts suggests that these early kings were credited with unifying fragmented clans and establishing the principles of Kushite authority. Archaeological evidence supports the rise of a socially stratified elite during the 9th and 8th centuries BCE. Excavations of Napatan-era tumuli reveal increasingly elaborate grave constructions, including large circular mounds, stone-lined burial chambers, and grave goods made from imported materials such as faience, bronze, and gold. These items indicate the presence of specialized craft production and long-distance trade, both requiring centralized control. Differences in burial scale and quality point to expanding hierarchical distinctions within society. Burial assemblages associated with high-status individuals include weapons, jewelry, fine ceramics, and ritual items, demonstrating a growing ideological emphasis on elite identity and status. Administratively, there is evidence for coordinated labor and resource management. Storage facilities, seal impressions, and architectural foundations at sites near Napata reveal early forms of organized governance. These structures imply that ruling families oversaw food collection, distribution, and ritual provisioning. Archaeologists have noted early standardization in ceramics and building layouts during this period, suggesting shared administrative practices across settlements. This increasing uniformity demonstrates the spread of a centralized political culture, even before the emergence of extensive monumental architecture. Dynastic formation was closely tied to the sacred geography of Jebel Barkal. The mountain, long associated with the god Ammonius during the New Kingdom, retained its symbolic significance among local populations. Early Kushite rulers appear to have embedded their authority within this religious framework by aligning themselves with the sacred landscape. The choice to center political power at Napata was strategic. It linked the rulers to a site already invested with sanctity and ritual prestige. Later inscriptions describe the kings as chosen or recognized by Ammonius of Napata, implying that this ideology had roots in the formative period of the monarchy. Interactions with Egypt during the Third Intermediate Period played a complex role in shaping early Kushite kingship. Egypt during the 9th and 8th centuries BCE was fragmented between northern dynasties based in the Delta and southern lineages in Thebes. Trade continued along established routes, enabling the movement of Egyptian goods, artisans, and ideas into Nubia. Rather than copying Egyptian models wholesale, early Napatan rulers selectively incorporated elements that enhanced their legitimacy. Among these were aspects of pharaonic titulary, including the adoption of royal epithets and ceremonial protocols. Such practices did not erase local traditions. Instead, they formed a hybrid ideological system that combined Nubian social structures with the prestige of Egypt's long-established monarchy. Material culture reflects this selective borrowing. Artisans in Napata produced items that blended Egyptian motifs with Nubian forms, including composite amulets, hybrid pottery styles, and iconography associated with kingship and divine sanction. Religious objects linked to the Ammonius cult appear more frequently in this period, indicating increasing investment in temple ritual and priestly infrastructure. The development of a state-sponsored religious establishment required administrative coordination, resource allocation, and labor management, all hallmarks of a consolidating monarchy. The emergence of early kingship is also visible in the organization of trade networks. Controlling access to goods such as gold, ivory, ostrich feathers, and animal skins provided material wealth that supported royal households. Nubian leaders acted as intermediaries between African interior regions and Egypt, giving them leverage in regional diplomacy. The accumulation of resources enabled rulers to finance building projects, sponsor religious ceremonies, and maintain followers, all essential components of political authority. By the late 9th and early 8th centuries BCE, evidence points to increasing standardization of royal practices. Tombs associated with elites show consistent elements of ritual preparation, suggesting that the monarchy had established norms for funerary behavior. The appearance of early palatial structures or elite residences near Napata further supports the presence of a centralized ruling family. Although the names of most early monarchs remain unknown, the political framework they created laid the foundation for the famous 25th dynasty that would later rule Egypt. As royal power grew, religion, especially the cult of Ammonius, became central to state ideology at Jebel Barkal. Religion and kingship fused to create the ideological core of the Kushite state. During the 10th to 8th centuries BCE, as political authority coalesced around Napata, the sacred mountain became the primary site through which rulers articulated their legitimacy. Jebel Barkal had long been associated with Egyptian notions of divine kingship, particularly through its role as a southern seat of the Ammonius cult during the New Kingdom. When Egyptian influence retreated, the symbolic power of the site did not disappear. Instead, emerging Kushite elites appropriated its earlier significance, transforming it into a uniquely Nubian center of religious and political life. Archaeological excavations at the foot of Jebel Barkal reveal a complex of temples that developed gradually during the early Napatan period. Structures dedicated to Ammonius, Mut, and other deities show successive phases of construction and renovation, indicating sustained investment by local rulers. Early building layers include modest shrines, later expanded into larger stone temples with pylons, colonnades, and sanctuaries. These architectural remains align with iconographic evidence, fragments of reliefs, statue bases, and offering tables, suggesting that temple ritual played a significant role in public and dynastic identity. The presence of priestly residences and storage facilities implies an organized religious community supported by state resources. Ammonius' role in legitimizing kingship is particularly clear in later inscriptions but reflects an ideological framework established during this formative period. Texts from the reigns of Pi and Taharqa repeatedly emphasize that Kushite kings were chosen by Ammonius of Napata, indicating that this belief had deep roots. The theological message was straightforward: authority derived from divine sanction rather than solely from lineage or military strength. Early Napatan rulers likely used oracles, a central feature of Ammonius' cult, to present their decisions as divinely guided. This practice strengthened their political position while reinforcing the connection between the royal household and the priesthood. Iconography from the region further demonstrates the integration of religious symbolism into early kingship. Depictions of rulers wearing the ramhorn headdress, a marker of Ammonius' cult, appear in Napatan art and statuary. The adoption of Egyptian-style regalia was not merely symbolic. It represented a deliberate claim to continuity with the prestigious traditions of the new kingdom. Yet the Kushite adaptation of these motifs created a distinct form of sacral kingship. While Egyptian pharaohs emphasized their role as intermediaries between gods and people, Napatan kings positioned themselves as the primary guardians of Ammonius' sacred domain, centered not at Thebes but at Jebel Barkal. The ideological reinterpretation of Jebel Barkal's meaning emerges clearly in the mountain's physical features. Ancient observers, including Egyptian priests, associated the peak with the uraeus, the cobra symbol of divine authority, due to its distinctive shape. Napatan rulers built upon this symbolism, treating the mountain as a visible manifestation of divine presence. Ritual activity concentrated around its eastern face, where natural formations were incorporated into temple layouts and ceremonial pathways. These spatial relationships reinforced the notion that the landscape itself conferred legitimacy, integrating geography and theology into the structure of the state. Religious continuity also depended on the maintenance of a professional priesthood. Evidence from Napatan-era inscriptions references priests of Ammonius acting as advisors and ritual specialists. Their involvement in state ceremonies, including coronations, festivals, and oracular consultations, indicates a symbiotic relationship between rulers and religious officials. The kings provided economic support for the temples, including land, livestock, and labor. In return, the priesthood affirmed the divine authority of the monarchy. This mutual dependence helped stabilize the early Kushite state during its formative centuries and provided a framework for future political expansion. The spread of Ammonius' cult beyond Napata is visible in the establishment of subsidiary temples along the Middle Nile. At sites such as Sanam, Kawa, and Dongola Reach, Napatan-era foundations demonstrate an expanding religious network linked directly to the central sanctuary at Jebel Barkal. These temples served multiple functions. They facilitated regional administration, coordinated tribute collection, and disseminated the ideological message of the monarchy. By anchoring political authority in a shared religious tradition, early Kushite rulers were able to unify disparate communities under a common framework. Material evidence also shows the persistence of earlier Nubian religious traditions alongside the growing dominance of the Ammonius cult. Cattle symbolism remains central to ritual practice, as seen in funerary contexts and iconography. Some Napatan temples incorporated local deities alongside Ammonius, reflecting continuity rather than replacement. This synthesis allowed the new state to integrate diverse cultural elements into a cohesive ideological system. The result was a form of kingship distinct from Egypt's. It was Egyptian in structure, Nubian in character, and anchored in a landscape imbued with sacred meaning. As the early Napatan monarchy grew more powerful, the cult of Ammonius became a critical tool in external relations, particularly with Egypt. Egyptian rulers of the Third Intermediate Period continued to revere Ammonius, and some sought legitimacy from oracles at Thebes. Kushite kings capitalized on this shared religious language, presenting themselves not as foreign innovators, but as rightful heirs to a tradition Egypt itself had allowed to fragment. By cultivating strong theological claims at Jebel Barkal, the Kushite dynasty positioned itself to intervene in Egyptian affairs with ideological credibility. The consolidation of religious authority helped create a political identity rooted in sacral kingship. Early Kushite rulers framed their right to rule in terms of divine selection, ritual participation, and stewardship of the sacred landscape. This model of governance strengthened internal unity and provided a foundation for external claims of authority. By the 8th century BCE, Napatan kings viewed themselves not only as leaders of a regional polity, but as guardians of a universal religious order centered on Ammonius. This ideological consolidation set the stage for Kush's most ambitious political project, the conquest of Egypt. Before Kushite kings were Egypt's crowns, they first moved quietly into the politics of Thebes. The expansion of Napatan power during the late 9th, early 8th centuries BCE was not the product of sudden conquest but of sustained political maneuvering, steady military pressure, and calculated diplomacy. As early rulers sought to consolidate their authority at home, They also recognized that influence over Upper Egypt, fragmented during the Third Intermediate Period, could significantly strengthen their position. The process began under Alara, a foundational figure in later Kushite tradition, and accelerated under his successor Kashta, whose policies brought Thebes into the Napatan sphere without extensive warfare. Alara's historical footprint is limited, but later Kushite king lists and inscriptions portray him as the first ruler to establish stable control over a unified Napatan kingdom. Archaeological evidence from early royal burials at El Kuru supports the existence of an emerging dynasty during this period, marked by increasingly elaborate tumuli, grave goods, and signs of centralized authority. Alara's reign appears to represent the transition from regional leadership to structured monarchy, laying the groundwork for external expansion. While direct textual evidence is absent, his association with the earliest royal monuments suggests that his influence reached beyond Napata, likely establishing initial contacts with communities along the Nile to the north. It was under Kashta, however, that the Kushite state began to exert real political weight in Upper Egypt. This shift is documented through inscriptions at Thebes referencing Kashta by his royal titles. The most significant evidence concerns his daughter, Amenertis I, who was installed as God's wife of Ammonius, a position of immense authority within Theban religious and political life. The adoption of Amenertis by the existing holder of the title, Shepenwepet I of the Libyan 23rd dynasty, indicates that Kashta's influence was recognized and accepted within Theban elite circles. This adoption was not merely ceremonial. It signified the gradual transfer of local power to the Kushite royal family. The installation of a Kushite princess in such a prominent religious office demonstrates the strategic nature of Napatan expansion. Rather than conquering Thebes through force, Kashta secured its allegiance through religious integration and dynastic partnership. This approach aligned with long-standing Egyptian traditions in which the god's wife of Ammonius served as a political stabilizer and often mediated authority between factions. By embedding his family into this institution, Kashta effectively positioned Kushite rulers as legitimate participants in Egyptian political life. Archaeological and textual evidence indicates that this process unfolded gradually. Kushite presence in Upper Egypt increased through a combination of diplomatic missions, military patrols, and economic interactions. Sites such as Elephantine and Aswan show signs of Napatan influence during this period, including inscriptions invoking Kushite kings and material culture consistent with Napatan craftsmanship. Egyptian elites facing internal fragmentation may have found Kushite alignment more stable than alliances with rival Libyan dynasties in the Delta. Kashta's expansion northward was facilitated by the weakening of Egyptian central authority. During the Third Intermediate Period, Egypt was divided among competing dynasties based in Tanis, Leontopolis, Heracleopolis, and Thebes. None possessed the strength to assert full control over the Nile Valley. This environment allowed external powers to shape local affairs, and Kush, with its stable monarchy and increasingly organized military, emerged as one of the most influential actors in the region. The gradual insertion of Kushite authority into Theban politics reflects a deliberate strategy to unify ideological and territorial control before launching broader territorial claims. The symbolic dimension of this expansion was equally important. Kushite kings adopted Egyptian royal titulary, participated in Egyptian religious rituals, and presented themselves as defenders of Ammonius. These actions reinforced their legitimacy in the eyes of Upper Egyptian elites who valued continuity with the new kingdom's religious traditions. The political message was clear. Kushite rulers were not foreign conquerors but rightful heirs to an Egyptian religious and cultural legacy that local dynasties could no longer uphold. By the early 8th century BCE, Kushite presence in Thebes was well established. Kashta's successors inherited not only expanding territorial influence, but also a network of religious and political relationships that tied Thebes directly to Napata. This integration set the stage for more assertive interventions in Egypt's dynastic conflicts. The peaceful takeover of Thebes demonstrated that Kush could expand its power without destabilizing the region, reinforcing the idea that Napatan kingship offered stability amid internal Egyptian fragmentation. With control of Thebes secure, Kush was positioned to intervene directly in Egypt's dynastic struggles. The rise of Pi, often spelled Pianki in earlier Egyptological literature, marks one of the most thoroughly documented military campaigns in all of pharaonic history. Unlike many earlier kings whose achievements survive in fragmented inscriptions or later annals, Pi left behind a lengthy monumental account, the victory stela erected at Gebel Barkal. This text provides a narrative of events, logistical details, ideological claims, and even direct quotations, making it one of the richest primary sources for the political landscape of late Third Intermediate Period Egypt. To understand the significance of Pi's campaign, it is necessary to reconstruct the context in which it occurred, a time when Egypt was deeply fragmented, with competing dynasties governing different regions of the Nile Valley. By the late 8th century BCE, Egypt was divided among multiple regional powers. In the Delta, Libyan-descended rulers of the 22nd and 23rd dynasties controlled various cities, often ruling only local territories rather than a unified kingdom. At the same time, a separate 24th dynasty arose in Sais under Tefnakht, whose ambitions to dominate the Delta brought him into conflict with neighboring chiefs. Meanwhile, Thebes and Upper Egypt experienced increasing Kushite influence. The adoption of Kashta's daughter Amenertis I into the office of God's wife of Ammonius ensured Napatan authority in the region. Pi inherited this delicate geopolitical environment, in which Egypt's internal fragmentation created both danger and opportunity for Kush. The victory stela begins by outlining Pi's motivations. Rather than presenting the campaign as a conquest driven purely by military ambition, the stela frames Pi's intervention as a response to religious duty. Tefnakh's expansion into Middle Egypt is depicted as a direct threat to the cult of Ammonius and the traditional order of the two lands. In this ideological framing, Pi is not merely marching north to subdue rivals. He is acting as a protector of divine order. This religious dimension is not rhetorical flourish. It reflects the thoroughly sacral nature of Napatan kingship and explains many of Pi's decisions throughout the campaign. The narrative describes how Pi received reports from loyal commanders in Middle Egypt, especially at Heracleopolis, who faced mounting pressure from Tefnakh's coalition. Pi responded by launching a combined river and land campaign, moving north along the Nile with ships and troops. One of the most striking features of the stela is its attention to ritual detail. Before crossing into Lower Egypt, Pi performed purification rites, refusing to eat the food of the Delta or allow his troops to violate temple precincts. The text emphasizes that the king remained in a state of ceremonial purity throughout the campaign, a reminder that military action was, in Napatan ideology, an extension of religious responsibility. As Pi advanced, a sequence of cities surrendered without significant resistance. The stela notes the submission of Hermopolis, Heracleopolis, and other towns whose leaders recognized the strategic futility of resisting a united Kushite Theban force. Each surrender is accompanied by ceremonial gestures. Local rulers prostrated themselves, presented their families, and pledged loyalty. Pi accepted these gestures but demanded oaths to Ammonius, integrating political allegiance into a sacral framework. This was a continuation of the Napatan strategy established under Kashta, the consolidation of political influence through religious legitimacy. The major resistance came from Memphis, controlled by the coalition loyal to Tefnakht. The stela provides unusually vivid detail about this phase of the campaign. Rather than storming Memphis by brute force, Pi conducted a siege, cutting off supplies and capturing ships. The account describes how the city's defenders were overwhelmed psychologically by the Kushite presence, leading to a swift breach of its defenses. Pi entered Memphis not as a destroyer but as a restorer of order, performing offerings in the temples and re-establishing religious rites that the stela portrays as having been neglected under Libyan rule. One of the most revealing elements of the stela is its depiction of Pi's interactions with defeated rulers. After securing Memphis, Pi received delegations from the Delta chiefs, including those who had previously resisted him. The stela describes their submission in ceremonial terms, emphasizing their humility in the presence of the Kushite king. Tefnakht himself did not appear in person. Instead, he sent a message acknowledging Pi's dominance and promising obedience. Pi accepted this formal submission but did not pursue Tefnacht militarily into the western delta. This restraint underscores the strategic purpose of the campaign, the restoration of unity under a recognized pharaoh, not the total destruction of rival powers. Archaeological evidence supports many elements of the stela's narrative. Excavations at Thebes, Memphis, and several Middle Egyptian sites confirm the presence of Kushite officials and military personnel during this period. Inscriptions from local rulers corroborate their submission to Pi, and the architectural record reflects a surge in building and temple donation consistent with the ideological goals described in the stela. At Gebel Barkal itself, the stela was placed in a prominent position, signaling the monumental importance of the event for Napatan royal ideology. The administrative system that Pi established after the campaign reveals a pragmatic approach to governance. Instead of replacing all local rulers with Kushite appointees, Pi allowed many Delta and Middle Egyptian chiefs to retain their positions, provided they swore allegiance to him and to Ammonius. This system mirrored earlier Egyptian models of indirect rule and allowed the Kushite state to govern a vast territory with limited administrative disruption. It also ensured that Pi's authority was recognized across cultural and regional boundaries, at least for the duration of his reign. However, the stela's triumphant tone must be balanced with historical hindsight. Although Pi achieved unification, the political situation in Egypt remained volatile. The Delta rulers continued to assert autonomy after his departure, and external threats from the Near East were mounting. Yet Pi's campaign created the ideological foundation for the full Kushite rule of Egypt under his successors. His conquest demonstrated that the kings of Napata were not merely regional powers but legitimate heirs to the pharaonic tradition. In its closing passages, the victory stela frames the entire campaign as a moral and religious triumph. Pi is depicted as both conqueror and priest, unifier and restorer. The text asserts that the gods themselves sanctioned his actions and that order was re-established in the two lands through his intervention. This combination of political, religious, and historical messaging explains why the stela has become an indispensable source for understanding the dynamics of the 25th dynasty. Through the victory stela, Pi crafted a narrative of kingship that blended Kushite traditions with Egyptian ideology, shaping the identity of the Kushite Empire at its imperial apex. The events it describes were not merely military conquests but the culmination of decades of gradual expansion, diplomatic influence, and religious integration. With Egypt unified, at least symbolically, the foundation was laid for the ambitious reigns of Pi's successors, who would attempt to preserve this fragile unity amid the growing pressures of the late 8th and early 7th centuries BC. Taharka's reign, spanning roughly 690 to 664 BCE, represents the apex of Kushite political reach and cultural influence within Egypt. As the third Kushite pharaoh to rule a unified Nile Valley, Taharka inherited both the opportunities created by Pi and Shabako and the mounting pressures that had begun to reshape the geopolitical landscape of the Near East. His kingship is unusually well attested through monumental inscriptions, temple expansions, Assyrian royal annals, and archaeological traces across Egypt and Nubia. Together, these sources provide a detailed portrait of a ruler who attempted to maintain traditional pharaonic ideological universalism while navigating an increasingly interconnected world dominated by imperial competition. Taharka ascended the throne during a period in which Egypt still exerted influence across the Levant, particularly through long-standing affiliations with small states along the coastal corridor. However, these regions were simultaneously being drawn into the orbit of Neo-Assyrian power. By the early 7th century BCE, Assyria under Esarhaddon had already absorbed much of northern Mesopotamia, Syria, and parts of Anatolia, establishing a militarized, expansionist state capable of projecting its authority far beyond traditional Near Eastern boundaries. The arrival of an African-based dynasty ruling Egypt added a new dimension to Assyria's imperial calculus. Egypt was both a potential threat and a prize. Domestically, Taharka pursued reforms that emphasized stability, monumental display, and religious orthodoxy. He continued the Napatan-initiated policy of temple renovation and expansion, most notably at Karnak, Kawa, and Memphis. These projects were not merely aesthetic embellishments but ideological statements. By restoring or enlarging temples dedicated to Ammonius, Mut, Khonsu, and other deities. Taharqa projected an image of legitimate pharaonic kingship rooted in piety and continuity. In Upper Nubia, his building program at Kawa, including the colonnaded temple and associated reliefs, reinforced the idea that Napatan rulers were custodians of divine favor. Through these constructions, Taharqa attempted to integrate Egyptian and Nubian religious traditions into a cohesive imperial ideology. Economically, his reign benefited initially from relative Nile stability and improved agricultural output. Inscriptions credit Taharqa with irrigation work and restoration of canals, though such claims were standard features of royal propaganda. Nevertheless, broader archaeological evidence suggests increased activity in state-supported building and craft production during the first decade of his rule. This period of internal strength allowed Taharqa to engage in diplomacy with Levantine states that viewed Egypt as a counterweight to Assyrian encroachment. Cities such as Ashkelon, Judah, and Tyre maintained at least intermittent political contact with Egypt, hoping to leverage its support to preserve their autonomy. Assyria, however, saw Egyptian involvement in the Levant as a direct challenge to its authority. Esarhaddon's inscriptions portray Egypt as the source of rebellion among Western vassals. In this context, conflict became inevitable. Around 674 BCE, Esarhaddon launched the first of several campaigns aimed at reducing Egyptian influence. Sources from both sides acknowledge that this initial invasion failed, due primarily to logistical overstretch and environmental difficulties. Taharqa capitalized on this outcome, portraying himself as a victorious defender of Egypt against a foreign aggressor. Reliefs and inscriptions from this period emphasize divine support for the Kushite king, reinforcing the ideological legitimacy of his rule. Assyria responded with greater determination. In 671 BCE, Esarhaddon organized a much larger and better supplied campaign. Assyrian annals describe a systematic march through the Levant, with local rulers compelled to support the invasion. When the Assyrian army reached the Nile Delta, Taharqa attempted to block their advance, but the sources indicate that his forces were outmatched. After several engagements, the Assyrians captured Memphis. Esarhaddon's records claim the seizure of the royal household, including members of Taharqa's family, though the historical details remain debated. Taharqa withdrew to Upper Egypt and Nubia but continued to assert authority where possible. Despite the setback, the conflict did not end with the capture of Memphis. Esarhaddon died shortly thereafter, and Assyria entered a brief succession transition. Taharqa used this interval to mount a counteroffensive aimed at reasserting influence in the Nile Valley. He regained control of parts of Upper Egypt and attempted to rally support from local elites who remained sympathetic to the traditional pharaonic order. But the Assyrian Empire under the new king, Ashurbanipal, quickly reasserted its power. By 667 to 666 BCE, Ashurbanipal launched a renewed campaign, this time aiming to eliminate Kushite authority in Egypt entirely. Assyrian records of the campaign under Ashurbanipal are characteristically vivid, emphasizing overwhelming military force and the subjugation of rebellious cities. They describe engagements at Thebes and other centers, though the extent of direct conflict is still debated in Egyptological scholarship. What is clear is that Taharqa faced mounting logistical and political constraints. His ability to mobilize Egyptian support diminished as Assyrian-installed governors and local princes shifted their allegiance to the new imperial power. Even Thebes, long a bastion of Kushite influence due to its religious ties, could not withstand the sustained pressure of Assyrian military operations. By around 664 BCE, Taharqa withdrew permanently to Nubia. The retreat did not represent the collapse of the Kushite state but rather a strategic reorientation. Assyria showed little interest in pursuing the Kushites deep into Nubia, focusing instead on establishing a compliant regime in Egypt under Psamtik I of the emerging 26th dynasty. Taharqa spent the remainder of his life reorganizing Napatan authority and maintaining the cultural institutions that had defined the 25th dynasty. His burial at Nuri, marked by one of the earliest Kushite pyramids at the site, underscores the continuity of Napatan royal ideology despite the loss of Egypt. Taharka's reign thus illustrates the dynamics of international power politics during the early 1st millennium BCE. Egypt under Kushite rule represented a significant regional force, but the structural realities of Near Eastern imperialism, particularly the unmatched military capacity of Assyria, constrained its ability to maintain territorial control in the Levant and Lower Egypt. The conflict between Taharka and the Assyrian kings reflects not simply a clash of rival monarchs but the broader transformation of the ancient world into increasingly centralized and militarized empires. Yet despite military defeats, Taharka's cultural and religious legacy remained profound. His building projects left enduring marks on Egyptian and Nubian landscapes. Artistic styles associated with his reign show a deliberate revival of earlier pharaonic forms, combined with distinctive Kushite aesthetics. The temples he renovated or constructed continued in active use long after the end of Kushite rule in Egypt. Moreover, later Nubian kings would remember Taharka as an exemplar of piety and royal authority, invoking his memory to legitimize their own reigns. Taharka's withdrawal signaled the end of the Kushite presence in Egypt, but not the end of the Kushite kingdom itself. The political center would soon shift southward, laying the foundations for a new phase of Nubian history. Following the withdrawal from Egypt, Kush reorganized itself around a new political center, Meroe. The relocation of Kushite political authority from Napata to Meroe between the 7th and 5th centuries BCE marks one of the most significant transformations in the history of the Nubian state. This transition did not occur abruptly but unfolded through a gradual restructuring of power, economy, and ideology as Kush adapted to new geopolitical realities following its withdrawal from Egypt. The Meroitic era that emerged from this shift represents a reconfiguration of the kingdom's administrative geography and its long-term strategic priorities. Archaeological, environmental, and textual evidence together illustrate why this southern city became the new core of Kushite political life. In the immediate aftermath of Assyrian dominance in Egypt, Napata remained the symbolic and religious heart of the kingdom. The Ammonius cult at Jebel Barkal continued to play a central role in legitimizing kingship, and the earliest successors of Taharka, such as Tanwudamani and Atlanursa, were still buried in the classic Napatan pyramid fields at Nuri. Yet the kingdom no longer controlled territories north of the First Cataract, and the reorientation of trade networks began to change the economic landscape. In this environment, the city of Meroe, located much farther south, near the Sixth Cataract region, gained increasing strategic importance. One of the primary motivations for this shift was geographic security. Meroe lay beyond the immediate reach of Egyptian or Near Eastern military campaigns, providing a degree of insulation from the kinds of large-scale invasions that had destabilized the 25th dynasty. Its position in the wide plains of the central Sudan created defensible terrain, surrounded by savanna zones and intersected by tributaries such as the Atbara. These environmental advantages helped solidify the city as a safe seat for long-term governance. By the mid-6th century BCE, external threats had diminished, but the memory of Assyrian intervention lingered, reinforcing the logic of situating core political functions deeper within Nubia. Ecological factors also played a decisive role. Meroe's hinterland provided access to resources not available near Napata, most notably iron ore deposits and abundant hardwoods suitable for charcoal production. Over time, these materials supported the development of a vibrant iron industry, one of the hallmarks of the later Meroitic economy. Although the full industrial scale of Meroitic ironworking belongs to later centuries, the move southward laid the foundation for this transformation. Agricultural potential was also greater around Meroe due to higher and more reliable rainfall, allowing for diversified cultivation and reducing dependence on the annual Nile flood. This ecological flexibility would become essential to the kingdom's resilience during periods of environmental stress. Trade networks equally shaped the city's rise. Meroe sat at a crossroads connecting the Nile corridor with trans-desert caravan routes leading toward the Red Sea, the Ethiopian highlands, and Central African regions. These routes facilitated the movement of gold, ivory, animal skins, incense, and exotic goods that fed long-distance exchange systems stretching across northeastern Africa and the ancient Mediterranean. Napata, while still an important cult center, did not command the same degree of commercial connectivity. As trade intensified during the late 1st millennium BCE, political elites increasingly aligned themselves with the economic opportunities emerging in the south. Archaeological evidence reflects this slow but steady redistribution of authority. Cemetery patterns provide some of the clearest indicators. The earliest royal burials at Meroe date to the mid-6th century BCE, overlapping with continued interments at Nuri and other Napatan sites. This dual pattern suggests a transitional phase in which rulers maintained ritual ties with Napata while simultaneously asserting new identities associated with Meroe. Over time, burial architecture in the southern capital became more elaborate and more distinctively Meroitic, incorporating local styles in tomb superstructures, chapel designs, and grave goods. The shift in funerary customs underscores a broader cultural and administrative realignment. Domestic architecture and palace complexes also reveal institutional change. Excavations at Meroe have uncovered large elite compounds featuring columned halls, storage facilities, and administrative spaces reflecting increasing bureaucratic complexity. These structures differ in layout and material from earlier Napatan buildings, indicating a shift in construction methods and perhaps in the organization of courtly life. The proliferation of locally produced ceramics, particularly fine polished wares and distinctive painted pottery, shows a movement toward regional stylistic traditions that would become characteristic of the Meroitic period. This material divergence is not merely aesthetic. It represents a gradual assertion of cultural autonomy. At the same time, the political landscape of Kush itself was evolving. The monarchy became more closely associated with Meroe as a residence and administrative base, even while kings continued to participate in coronation rituals linked to Jebel Barkal. The symbolic power of Napata did not disappear. Instead, its ceremonial functions complemented the increasingly practical governmental role of the southern capital. This duality reflects the flexibility of Kushite political culture, which was capable of integrating older ideological frameworks with new institutional realities. The shift southward also coincided with transformations in the social fabric of the kingdom. Pastoral communities, agriculturalists, and emerging urban populations interacted more densely in the Meroitic region than in the narrow northern stretches of the Nile Valley. This demographic diversity contributed to the development of new administrative systems needed to manage labor, taxation, crafts, and trade. While textual sources from this transitional period are scarce, later Meroitic inscriptions imply the presence of a growing scribal class and the gradual emergence of new administrative titles. The increasing complexity of state institutions aligns with the city's growing economic role. The transition to Meroe cannot be understood solely as a political decision. It was a multi-generational process influenced by shifting regional dynamics. Egyptian power under the Sate kings of the 26th dynasty remained focused on the north and showed limited interest in deep Nubia, reducing direct pressure on Kush but simultaneously limiting opportunities for northern expansion. In this context, consolidating internal strength became a priority. The move southward enabled Kush to develop independently, free from the cycles of conflict that had defined the Napatan political environment. By the 5th century BCE, Meroe had become the effective capital of the kingdom, even if Napata maintained its role as a religious center. The Meroitic phase of Kushite history, typically defined by new artistic styles, administrative innovations, and the development of the Meroitic script, was made possible by this earlier strategic relocation. The city's rise heralded a new period of political autonomy and experimentation, marked by shifts in royal ideology, changes in state organization, and increasing engagement with diverse cultural influences from across Africa. The relocation of power to Meroe thus represents a deliberate and adaptive response to the geopolitical, economic, and environmental pressures of the late 1st millennium BCE. It marks the beginning of a new era in Kushite history characterized by innovation, resilience, and a redefined relationship between state and landscape. This transformation opened the way for new political institutions and distinctive models of kingship that would shape the kingdom for centuries. This new capital created space for new political institutions and unique forms of kingship. In the Meroitic period, political authority was structured to reflect both continuity with Napatan traditions and innovations suited to the southern capital's social and cultural context. One of the most notable features of Meroitic governance was the prominent role of royal women, particularly queens referred to as candaces. Archaeological and epigraphic evidence demonstrates that these women were not merely consorts or ceremonial figures but active participants in governance, diplomacy, and succession. Temple inscriptions, pyramid texts, and reliefs show queens engaging in religious ceremonies, leading military contingents, and sometimes ruling independently, indicating a level of institutionalized female authority unique in the broader context of the ancient Near East and Africa. The succession practices of Meroe further distinguished its political organization from earlier Napatan models. While Napatan kingship largely followed a patrilineal line, with authority transmitted through male heirs under the ideological auspices of Ammonius worship, Meroitic succession frequently involved co-rulership arrangements and recognition of royal women as central figures in legitimizing the throne. Inscriptions from royal pyramids at Meroe indicate that siblings, particularly sisters of the king, were often married to the reigning monarch to consolidate dynastic continuity. Candaces could act as regents for young kings, and in certain instances, such as Amanishakheto and Amanitor, they assumed full sovereign authority, commissioning monumental building projects, directing trade initiatives, and commanding armies. Epigraphic evidence reveals that these arrangements were integrated into the kingdom's religious and diplomatic frameworks. Royal women were associated with the cult of Ammonius and local deities, which reinforced their political authority. Reliefs from temples at Naka and Musaweret Sufra depict queens performing rituals equivalent to those of male rulers, emphasizing their sacral legitimacy. Beyond ceremonial roles, candaces are documented in correspondence with foreign powers, suggesting participation in interstate diplomacy. For example, inscriptions reference treaties or trade arrangements in which queens played a decisive role in securing alliances or maintaining Kushite influence over Nubian trade routes. These patterns illustrate a systemic integration of gendered authority into the state apparatus. The representation of rulers during the Meroitic period reflects a conscious shift toward indigenous expression. While Napatan kings had largely adopted Egyptian artistic conventions, Meroitic rulers, including candaces, were depicted with distinct Nubian features, attire, and regalia in reliefs and sculptures. This stylistic evolution conveyed both local legitimacy and political autonomy, signaling that Meroe's authority derived from its own cultural heritage, rather than being a continuation of Egyptian norms. Inscriptions often combined hieroglyphic and Meroitic cursive scripts, further emphasizing the kingdom's hybrid yet increasingly independent identity. Succession arrangements in Meroe also addressed the practical challenges of governing a geographically dispersed kingdom. Kings and queens needed to ensure loyalty among distant provincial centers, trade intermediaries, and military commanders. The recognition of co-rulership and the prominent role of queens functioned as both a stabilizing mechanism and a method of integrating competing elite factions. By situating women at the center of succession, the monarchy could draw on broader familial networks to maintain continuity while mitigating the risk of factional disputes that had occasionally destabilized Napatan rule. Archaeological evidence of pyramid complexes shows coordinated funerary architecture for both kings and queens, highlighting the institutionalized nature of their authority. In addition to succession, the administrative responsibilities of Meroitic rulers became increasingly complex. Kings and candaces oversaw agricultural production, trade logistics, taxation, and craft specialization. Inscriptions from temples and stelae mention officials with specialized titles, suggesting a bureaucratic network capable of implementing royal policy across the kingdom. Royal women frequently exercised oversight in these domains, particularly in regions distant from the capital, where delegated authority required both symbolic and practical validation. The integration of female leadership into state administration demonstrates the adaptability of Meroitic governance to the demands of a larger, more economically diversified polity. Meroitic queens also played a key role in consolidating legitimacy through religious institutions. By participating directly in temple construction and ritual activities, they reinforced the ideological foundation of kingship. Temple reliefs frequently depict them alongside deities such as Ammonius, Apidmak, and locally significant spirits, underlining their dual political and spiritual authority. In several cases, queens commissioned large-scale temple projects independently of male rulers, illustrating the tangible impact of female power on urban and ceremonial landscapes. These constructions reinforced the perception of queens as guarantors of both divine favor and dynastic continuity. The integration of queenship into the succession system had long-term implications for the stability and adaptability of the Meroitic state. Unlike rigid patrilineal systems, the Meroitic model allowed for flexible transfer of authority, enabling the kingdom to maintain continuity even during periods of dynastic uncertainty or external pressure. This institutionalized female authority also strengthened the ideological connection between rulership and religious sanction, ensuring that Meroitic kingship remained both sacred and socially cohesive. The prominence of candaces in inscriptions and material culture reflects a deliberate political choice, linking gendered authority to statecraft rather than relegating it to ceremonial symbolism. By the end of the 5th century BCE, the patterns established during the early Meroitic period, co-rulership, matrilineal influence in succession, and religiously sanctioned female authority, had become institutionalized. This structural innovation allowed Kush to maintain internal cohesion, regulate provincial territories, and negotiate external relations without excessive reliance on military coercion. The collaborative model of rulership facilitated the management of diverse economic and social networks, reinforcing the adaptability of the kingdom in a changing geopolitical environment. In Meroe, power was shared in ways unusual for much of the ancient world. The combined authority of kings and queens created a system capable of absorbing political shocks, supporting economic growth, and projecting ideological legitimacy. This model of governance shaped the evolution of Kushite institutions and contributed directly to the kingdom's longevity and resilience. The complex interplay between dynastic strategy, female political agency, and religious legitimacy laid the groundwork for the subsequent expansion of state infrastructure and administrative sophistication. These evolving institutions required increasingly complex administrative systems. Meroe's political stability relied heavily on an increasingly sophisticated system of administration that extended royal authority across the kingdom's southern and central territories. Archaeological excavations reveal a network of administrative buildings, granaries, and storage complexes associated with both the royal court and provincial centers. These structures indicate the collection, redistribution, and monitoring of agricultural surpluses, craft production, and trade goods, demonstrating that governance in Meroe was organized around both centralized oversight and delegated local management. Inscriptions from temples and stele record transactions involving tribute, tax obligations, and labor allocation, providing tangible evidence of a bureaucratic apparatus capable of sustaining a complex polity. Provincial governors, often drawn from elite families connected to the royal house, oversaw regional administration, coordinated labor for infrastructure projects, and maintained order on behalf of the crown. Their authority combined civil, military, and religious functions, reflecting continuity with Napatan practices while incorporating innovations suited to the expanded geographic and economic scope of Meroe. Governors monitored agricultural production along the Nile and in adjacent savanna zones, collected levies in the form of grain, livestock, or manufactured goods, and ensured the movement of resources to the capital. Inscriptions suggest that officials documented these transactions systematically, implying a standardized record-keeping system that supported accountability and reinforced the crown's legitimacy. Economic integration was further facilitated by the kingdom's engagement with long-distance trade networks. Meroitic administrators coordinated the flow of goods such as gold, ivory, and exotic animals along caravan routes linking the Nile Valley with the Red Sea and the African interior. Central oversight allowed the monarchy to control key resources, which were essential for sustaining both the elite culture of the capital and the diplomatic leverage necessary for regional influence. Archaeological evidence of specialized craft workshops in iron, ceramics, and textiles indicates that provincial centers contributed directly to the kingdom's wealth and administrative capacity, highlighting the interdependence of local production and royal authority. The provincial system also played a critical role in maintaining social cohesion. Governors mediated between the crown and local communities, implementing laws, managing land tenure, and organizing labor for both agricultural and construction projects. This administrative framework ensured that the kingdom could respond effectively to environmental fluctuations, such as Nile flooding variability, while maintaining a consistent flow of tribute to Meroe. The coordination of governance across multiple provinces demonstrates that state power in Kush was not confined to ceremonial capitals, but was embedded in a network of regional oversight and resource management. Meroe's political stability rested on its expanding administrative networks. By combining centralized authority with empowered provincial officials, the kingdom maintained cohesion, supported economic growth, and ensured the efficient functioning of state institutions. These administrative foundations enabled the development of distinctive Meroitic cultural, artistic, and religious forms, which flourished under the protection of a highly organized political structure. With political foundations stabilized, Meroitic culture developed distinctive artistic and religious forms. Kushite religion during the Meroitic period represented a complex synthesis of imported Egyptian religious traditions and indigenous African belief systems. Central to this religious landscape was the worship of Ammonius, the Theban deity whose cult had been transferred from Napata and maintained continuity with earlier Napatan and Egyptian practices. Simultaneously, local deities, most prominently Apidmak, the lion-headed warrior god, gained prominence in the southern regions of the kingdom, reflecting the assertion of indigenous spiritual authority. Archaeological and epigraphic evidence demonstrates that these religious systems were not mutually exclusive. Rather, they were integrated in a manner that reinforced both royal legitimacy and social cohesion. Temple architecture provides some of the clearest evidence of this syncretism. At Naka, excavations reveal a temple complex combining Egyptian-style pylons, hypostyle halls, and sanctuaries with uniquely Meroitic decorative motifs. Reliefs depict Ammonius alongside Apidmak, illustrating their complementary roles in royal ideology. Similarly, Musaweret es Sufra contains monumental temples dedicated to Apidmak with lion-headed iconography, sphinxes, and step terraces that deviate from traditional Egyptian architectural norms. These structures suggest that Meroitic rulers intentionally emphasized local religious identity while retaining the prestige associated with Egyptian cultic forms, creating a hybrid visual and ritual environment that validated their sovereignty across the kingdom. Ritual practices further highlight this integration. Temple inscriptions describe offerings of incense, cattle, and luxury goods, while stelae record royal participation in ceremonies designed to honor both Ammonius and indigenous deities. Priests occupied central roles in maintaining cultic continuity, overseeing the performance of rituals and administering temple estates that were often economic as well as religious centers. These records indicate that religious authority was closely linked to political legitimacy. The king's endorsement of these cults signaled both piety and control over the spiritual and material resources of the kingdom. The dual focus on Egyptian and indigenous deities also reflected broader cultural dynamics. Kushite rulers leveraged Egyptian religious forms to assert continuity with past Napatan authority and to align themselves symbolically with pharaonic power, which remained recognized in regional memory. At the same time, the elevation of Apidmak and other local gods asserted the distinctiveness of Kushite identity and allowed rulers to legitimize their sovereignty in regions far from Napatan religious centers. This strategic incorporation of multiple religious traditions illustrates the kingdom's ability to balance foreign prestige with indigenous authority. Material culture provides additional evidence of this syncretism. Sculptural reliefs, temple carvings, and votive objects combine Egyptian iconography, such as headdresses, scepters, and divine postures, with Meroitic stylistic conventions, including elongated proportions, distinctive headdresses, and indigenous animal motifs. Inscriptions in both Egyptian hieroglyphs and the developing Meroitic script appear in temple contexts, emphasizing the administrative and ritual significance of literacy in maintaining cultic practice. These hybrid forms reflect deliberate ideological choices intended to consolidate power and unify a culturally diverse population. The social role of religion extended beyond elite rituals to broader society. Temples functioned as centers for redistribution, craftsmanship, and education, linking religious observance with economic and civic life. Through temple-based festivals, offerings, and public ceremonies, rulers communicated authority and reinforced social norms, ensuring that religious ideology permeated multiple layers of Kushite society. This integration of spiritual, administrative, and economic functions underscores the centrality of religion in maintaining both cohesion and political legitimacy. Kushite religion blended Egyptian traditions with powerful indigenous deities. By intertwining imported and local religious systems, the kingdom produced a resilient ideological framework that legitimized kingship, reinforced social hierarchies, and reflected the cultural plurality of the Nile Valley. The hybridization of temple architecture, ritual practice, and iconography illustrates the adaptive strategies through which Kushite rulers maintained authority and identity. The development of these cults coincided with changes in literacy and language, which facilitated the administration and cultural consolidation of the kingdom. The emergence of the Meroitic script during the 3rd century BCE represents a pivotal moment in Kushite cultural and administrative history. For the first time, the kingdom possessed a writing system developed specifically to express the indigenous Meroitic language, distinct from the Egyptian hieroglyphic tradition that had dominated Napatan and earlier periods. The script exists in 2 forms: a cursive version used primarily for administrative and daily record-keeping, and a hieroglyphic variant reserved for monumental inscriptions and religious contexts. Archaeologists and epigraphers have recovered texts from temple walls, royal tombs, stelae, and papyri, providing fragmentary but valuable insights into governance, ritual practice, and social organization. While translation remains limited, patterns in word usage, formulaic expressions, and the structural layout of texts reveal that Meroitic literacy was employed systematically to support both state administration and religious ideology. The development of a dedicated script reflects broader linguistic continuity in the Nile Valley. Meroitic belongs to the Nubian branch of the Eastern Sudanic languages, and inscriptions show that certain grammatical and lexical features persisted from earlier Nubian dialects spoken along the Middle Nile. This continuity enabled a literate elite to document laws, record property ownership, and codify ritual procedures in a manner intelligible to a select audience while preserving the cultural distinctiveness of the Meroitic state. Inscriptions suggest that literacy was concentrated among royal scribes, priests, and administrators, who played a central role in maintaining both secular and sacred knowledge. Their expertise in script and ritual ensured that political authority could be effectively communicated across the kingdom's dispersed territories. Meroitic cursive inscriptions were often inscribed on papyrus, wooden objects, or pottery, reflecting their practical use in everyday administration. These documents include references to taxation, trade, and labor obligations, indicating a bureaucratic network that relied on written record-keeping to function efficiently. Hieroglyphic Meroitic, by contrast, appeared on temple walls, stelae, and funerary monuments, serving a primarily ideological and commemorative function. The hieroglyphic variant demonstrates that the script was not merely utilitarian but also a vehicle for projecting royal authority, religious legitimacy, and dynastic continuity. Inscriptions frequently mention kings, queens, and deities, reinforcing the inseparability of political and religious spheres in Meroitic governance. Despite significant progress in decipherment, the Meroitic script remains only partially understood. Scholars can recognize names, titles, and formulaic structures, but full comprehension of vocabulary and syntax is limited. Nevertheless, even these partial readings illuminate aspects of social and administrative life. Inscriptions confirm the active participation of queens and candates in religious and state affairs, document economic exchanges, and reflect ritualized sequences for royal ceremonies. The existence of standardized formulas and repeated structures suggests an organized system of training for scribes, ensuring that literacy supported the efficient functioning of state institutions over extended periods. The creation of the Meroitic script also played a central role in the kingdom's cultural identity. By adopting a writing system tailored to its own language, Kush reinforced its autonomy from Egypt while maintaining continuity with broader Nile Valley traditions. The script allowed rulers to formalize ideological claims, codify legal and economic regulations, and preserve sacred knowledge for future generations. Its use in both monumental and administrative contexts demonstrates the integration of literacy into multiple dimensions of Meroitic society, from elite political circles to local governance networks. The development of Meroitic literacy further influenced artistic and architectural production. Temple inscriptions, royal tombs, and public monuments incorporated written texts alongside reliefs and decorative motifs, creating a unified visual and textual program that conveyed ideology and authority. Inscriptions were frequently paired with images of rulers, deities, and ceremonial activities, linking written language directly with iconographic representation. This combination of text and imagery reinforced state messaging and facilitated the transmission of cultural values throughout the kingdom. The creation of the Meroitic script marked a major cultural turning point. It enabled the kingdom to document its political, religious, and economic systems in a distinctly Kushite language, consolidating administrative authority and reinforcing cultural identity. Literacy became both a practical tool for governance and a symbolic marker of autonomy, connecting political power with knowledge production and ideological continuity. As literacy expanded, Meroitic art and architecture developed recognizable regional styles. Kushite art and architecture during the Meroitic period represent a distinctive synthesis of local innovation, Egyptian influence, and broader regional interaction. Among the most visible markers of this cultural identity is the construction of pyramids at Meroe, which diverge significantly from earlier Napatan and Egyptian models. While Napatan pyramids had already adapted Egyptian funerary forms to local contexts, Meroitic structures were generally smaller, with steeper angles and elaborated chapel complexes at their bases. Excavations at the northern cemetery of Meroe reveal hundreds of these pyramids, often grouped in clusters associated with royal and elite burials. The variation in pyramid size and construction technique reflects both social hierarchy and local adaptation to available materials, particularly sandstone and mud brick. The evolution of royal iconography parallels these architectural innovations. Reliefs, statues, and stelae produced in Meroe depict rulers in poses reminiscent of Egyptian pharaonic conventions, holding scepters, wearing crowns, and participating in ritual ceremonies, but consistently integrate distinctively Nubian physiognomy and stylistic preferences. Kings and queens are frequently rendered with elongated facial features, high cheekbones, and fuller body proportions, signaling a conscious assertion of indigenous identity. Iconographic motifs also incorporate local symbols, such as lions and gazelles, emphasizing both martial prowess and natural abundance. These visual strategies function to assert legitimacy, communicate authority, and reinforce the dynastic presence across urban and ceremonial spaces. Workshops associated with royal and religious complexes produced a broad spectrum of material culture, including statuary, ceramics, metalwork, and jewelry. Archaeological evidence at sites such as Musaweret Sufra and Naka reveals specialized production areas where artisans worked with stone, bronze, and iron. Relief carvings on temple walls and pylons illustrate mythological scenes, royal processions, and ritualized offerings, frequently accompanied by inscriptions in Meroitic hieroglyphs or cursive script. These artifacts indicate a highly organized system of artistic production designed to reinforce both religious ideology and royal authority, demonstrating the integration of craft specialization into state administration. Temple architecture during this period reflects a synthesis of Egyptian and indigenous forms. At Naka, the Ammonius and Epidmac temples feature pylons, hypostyle halls, and sanctuaries combined with local innovations, such as freestanding columns decorated with lion-headed capitals and stepped platforms that facilitate processional rituals. Musaweret Sufra's Great Enclosure, one of the largest known Meroitic complexes, exhibits monumental courtyards, colonnaded halls, and sculpted reliefs, illustrating the scale and sophistication of Meroitic religious architecture. These complexes functioned as ceremonial centers, economic hubs, and symbols of dynastic legitimacy, underscoring the interrelation of religion, politics, and art in Kushite society. Funerary art further reflects the kingdom's hybrid aesthetic. Sarcophagi, offering tables, and tomb reliefs combine Egyptian funerary motifs with local iconography, often emphasizing solar and animal symbolism distinctive to Meroe. Objects found within tombs, such as pottery, jewelry, and figurines, display consistent stylistic traits that differentiate the Meroitic period from both earlier Napatan forms and contemporary Egyptian art. This careful blending of influences suggests an intentional effort to assert Kushite cultural identity, while maintaining a visual language intelligible within the broader Nile cultural sphere. Royal iconography also functioned as a medium for political communication. Monumental reliefs on temple walls and palace facades depict kings and queens engaging in ritual, martial, or administrative activities, signaling authority to both domestic and foreign audiences. The recurrent depiction of candaces alongside male rulers in temple reliefs illustrates the integration of female authority into state ideology. The pairing of rulers with deities such as Ammonius and Epidmac emphasizes divine sanction while visually reinforcing the sacred nature of kingship and dynastic continuity. Workshops and craft specialization were supported by economic and technological innovation, including the expansion of iron production and improved transport networks. Metalwork, stone carving, and ceramic production required organized labor, access to raw materials, and administrative oversight, linking artistic production directly to the kingdom's broader economic infrastructure. The coordination of these activities indicates that Kushite rulers recognized the strategic value of art and architecture as both ideological tools and markers of state sophistication. Kushite art and architecture formed one of the most distinctive visual traditions of the ancient Nile. By blending Egyptian iconography, Nubian physiognomy, and indigenous motifs, Meroitic rulers established a recognizable visual language that asserted political legitimacy, reinforced religious ideology, and communicated social hierarchy. Monumental temples, pyramids, reliefs, and statues collectively created a coherent system of symbolic expression, integrated with administrative and ritual functions across the kingdom. These cultural developments rested on economic strength and technological innovation, enabling Meroe to sustain a flourishing artistic and architectural program over centuries. Kushite economic stability depended fundamentally on the effective management of agricultural and pastoral resources. The kingdom's settlements along the Middle and Upper Nile leveraged the predictable annual flooding to cultivate cereals such as emmer wheat, barley, and sorghum, using seasonal inundations to replenish soil fertility. Archaeological surveys along the Nile floodplain reveal evidence of field boundaries, irrigation channels, and storage facilities, indicating that Meroitic farmers coordinated production at both household and community levels. These adaptations allowed for consistent yields despite variability in Nile inundations and local rainfall patterns, ensuring food security for urban centers, royal households, and administrative personnel. In addition to cereal agriculture, cattle pastoralism played a central role in Kushite society. Herding was integrated with both economic and ritual activities, with cattle serving as a source of meat, milk, hides, and traction, as well as offerings in religious ceremonies. Burial evidence from Meroitic cemeteries indicates that livestock was sometimes interred with elite individuals, emphasizing its dual social and economic significance. Pastoral strategies were tailored to the savanna and semi-arid landscapes beyond the Nile floodplain, enabling mobile grazing patterns that complemented settled agriculture. This combination of pastoral and agrarian systems demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of regional environmental constraints and opportunities. Resource extraction was another pillar of Kush's economic base. Gold, copper, and semi-precious stones were mined in the surrounding deserts, particularly in the Eastern Desert and Nubian Mountains, supporting both domestic needs and long-distance trade. Archaeological findings include mining tools, slag deposits, and smelting sites, reflecting organized exploitation and processing of metals. These operations were often coordinated with agricultural calendars, ensuring a continuous supply of essential materials for tool production, ceremonial objects, and luxury goods. The integration of mining and agriculture highlights the kingdom's capacity to manage diverse economic activities across varied ecological zones. Water management was crucial in both floodplain and upland areas. Irrigation canals, wells, and reservoirs allowed farmers to buffer against seasonal variability and extend cultivation beyond the immediate flood zone. Botanical remains recovered from sites such as Hammadab and Gebel Atta demonstrate the cultivation of multiple crop types, suggesting crop rotation and risk diversification strategies. Such practices minimize the impact of droughts or uneven flooding, ensuring that urban populations and administrative centers could maintain a stable food supply. These measures indicate a degree of central oversight and coordination, likely facilitated by local governors or temple authorities, whose records show the allocation of land, labor, and storage resources. The organization of agricultural labor also reflects social and economic complexity. Evidence suggests that both free households and bonded laborers contributed to large-scale cultivation, storage, and redistribution efforts. Grain and livestock were collected as tribute or taxes, supporting royal palaces, religious institutions, and regional administrative centers. Ceramic storage jars, granaries, and sealed administrative facilities excavated in Meroe and surrounding sites indicate systematic resource accounting, demonstrating that the kingdom possessed both practical and bureaucratic mechanisms to manage agricultural production effectively. Kush's economic base relied on flexible agricultural systems suited to varied landscapes. The integration of irrigated farming, seasonal cultivation, pastoralism, and resource extraction created a resilient economy capable of sustaining population centers and supporting administrative structures. The dual focus on cereals and livestock allowed the kingdom to balance risk and maximize productivity across floodplain and savanna environments, providing the material foundation for social stratification, political authority, and cultural development. Beyond agriculture, Meroe became famous for a technological innovation, ironworking, which would come to define its industrial and economic identity. Meroe's reputation as an industrial center rested largely on its prolific iron production, which emerged as a defining feature of the kingdom's technological and economic identity. Archaeological excavations across the northern and central regions of the city have uncovered extensive evidence of ironworking, including furnaces, slag deposits, tuyères, and fragments of smelting tools. These finds demonstrate that Meroe developed large-scale, organized metallurgical production, capable of supplying both domestic needs and regional trade. Radiocarbon dating indicates that ironworking in the city intensified from the 5th century BCE onward, reaching its peak during the 3rd to 1st centuries BCE, coinciding with the kingdom's economic and cultural consolidation. The technical sophistication of Meroitic iron production is evident in the design of furnaces and the scale of slag heaps, which reflect high temperatures and controlled smelting processes. Archaeologists have documented both bloomery and furnace types, indicating experimentation with different metallurgical techniques suited to locally available iron ore. Tools, weapons, and ceremonial objects produced from this iron demonstrate not only functional applications but also aesthetic considerations, suggesting that artisans combined utility with symbolic expression. The concentration of production sites near iron ore deposits in the Nuba Hills and other regions highlights the strategic exploitation of natural resources and the integration of mining, smelting, and forging into a coordinated economic system. Iron production had far-reaching implications for both domestic infrastructure and military capacity. Iron tools facilitated more efficient agriculture, including clearing fields, digging irrigation channels, and constructing storage facilities. Iron weapons and defensive equipment reinforced the kingdom's military capabilities, enabling control over trade routes and regional territories. By standardizing production and distributing resources through administrative networks, the Meroitic state ensured that iron technology supported both economic productivity and political stability. The economic impact of iron extended well beyond the borders of Meroe. Archaeological and textual evidence indicates that iron ingots, finished tools, and weapons were traded extensively throughout the Nile Valley, the Red Sea coast, and into the African interior. This trade created a feedback loop in which the profits from iron facilitated investment in other sectors, such as agriculture, craft production, and temple construction. The presence of Meroitic iron artifacts in distant regions attests to the kingdom's influence and the demand for its technologically advanced products, establishing Meroe as a key node in regional economic networks. Organizationally, ironworking required significant labor coordination and administrative oversight. Slag distribution patterns, Workshop layouts and proximity to water sources suggest that production was centrally managed, likely under the supervision of royal officials or temple authorities. Skilled metallurgists were essential to maintain furnace efficiency, manage fuel supplies, and ensure quality control. Inscriptions and iconography from temple contexts imply that ironworking may have also held ritual significance, linking technological expertise with religious sanction and royal authority. Meroe developed one of the most productive iron industries of the ancient world. The kingdom's mastery of metallurgical technology not only supported agriculture, craft production, and military preparedness, but also reinforced its status in regional trade networks. Iron production exemplifies how technological innovation underpinned political and economic strength, enabling Meroe to sustain urban centers, assert influence over peripheral territories, and maintain internal cohesion. Iron, livestock, and textiles flowed along extensive trade networks across Africa, connecting Meroe to markets, resources, and political partners throughout the Nile Valley and beyond. Kush's economic influence extended far beyond the Nile Valley through well-established trade networks connecting Central Africa with Egypt, the Arabian Peninsula, and the Mediterranean world. Archaeological evidence, combined with classical sources, documents a complex system of caravan routes, riverine transport, and maritime connections. Goods moved along the Nile from Meroe to the First Cataract and into Egypt, where Kushite commodities were exchanged for grain, luxury items, and finished products. Beyond the Nile, caravans crossed arid regions to reach the Red Sea coast, facilitating maritime trade with Arabian ports and further access to Hellenistic and, later, Roman markets. Classical authors such as Strabo and Pliny the Elder reference Kushite trade in gold, ivory, exotic animals, and other commodities, corroborating archaeological findings of imported amphorae, pottery, and luxury goods. The trade in gold was particularly central to Kush's economic standing. Gold mines in Nubia supplied both domestic elites and foreign markets, enabling Meroe to participate in long-distance exchange as a major supplier. Archaeologists have identified mining tools, smelting facilities, and caches of processed gold, highlighting a sophisticated system of extraction and distribution. Ivory, obtained from local elephants and African sources, was carved into luxury items and transported along established trade corridors, often in conjunction with live animals destined for Egypt, Arabia, or Mediterranean elite markets. These commodities reinforced Kush's economic and diplomatic leverage, as controlling scarce resources translated directly into political influence. Caravan trade facilitated the exchange of textiles, pottery, and iron, linking local production with broader regional demand. Meroitic textiles, woven from locally cultivated flax and wool, were highly prized and often traded alongside iron implements and crafted goods. Amphorae, imported from Hellenistic Egypt and the Levant, demonstrate that Kush was integrated into Mediterranean supply chains, receiving wine, oil, and other consumables while exporting African products. Archaeological finds of imported ceramics and glassware at Meroitic sites further attest to the kingdom's participation in intercontinental exchange. The administration of trade required logistical coordination and oversight. Meroitic officials and provincial governors monitored the movement of caravans, collected tribute and customs duties, and regulated access to strategic river crossings and desert routes. Inscriptions indicate that royal authority extended to caravan management, ensuring that trade revenues flowed to central institutions, including the palace and temples. The integration of trade into state structures illustrates the kingdom's ability to convert economic activity into political and social stability, reinforcing both elite power and regional cohesion. Kush controlled vital trade corridors linking Central Africa with the Mediterranean world. By regulating commerce along the Nile, Red Sea, and desert networks, the kingdom secured essential resources, sustained technological industries such as iron production, and maintained its position as a regional power. Trade was not only an economic enterprise but also a mechanism for cultural exchange, bringing foreign goods, ideas, and technologies into the kingdom while projecting Kushite influence outward. These trade links sometimes led to conflict, especially with Egypt and Rome, as the strategic and economic value of these corridors drew foreign attention and occasional military intervention. The Kushite military was a critical instrument of state power, structured to address both internal security and external threats across the Nile Valley and surrounding regions. Archaeological and textual evidence indicates that the army comprised several specialized units, including infantry, archers, cavalry, and, during earlier periods, chariot contingents. Infantry formed the backbone of the forces, equipped with spears, shields, and axes suitable for close combat, while archers provided long-range offensive capabilities. Reliefs from temples and palaces, including depictions at Naka and Musawwir at Sufra, illustrate disciplined formations of troops advancing under royal command, suggesting organized hierarchies and tactical coordination. Archery was particularly central to Kushite military identity. Nubian bows, often shorter and highly flexible compared to Egyptian models, allowed for rapid, accurate volleys, making Kushite archers highly sought after in regional conflicts. Classical sources, including Assyrian inscriptions, attest to the fearsome reputation of Nubian and Kushite bowmen, emphasizing their ability to control battlefield engagement and skirmish effectively against larger or more heavily armed forces. Archaeological finds, such as arrowheads of diverse shapes and sizes, corroborate the sophisticated use of projectile weaponry in both hunting and military contexts. Cavalry and chariot units augmented infantry and archery operations, providing mobility and shock power in open terrain. While chariots were used less extensively than in earlier Egyptian campaigns, their presence in reliefs and funerary depictions suggests that elite contingents employed them for ceremonial purposes as well as battlefield advantage. Cavalry units, introduced in later Meroitic periods, facilitated rapid reconnaissance, flanking maneuvers, and the protection of trade routes and borders. The combination of infantry, archers, and mounted troops created a flexible, multi-tiered force capable of responding to diverse threats and projecting power across the kingdom. Fortifications were an essential aspect of military infrastructure. Excavations at sites such as Buhin, Khazar Ibrim, and later Meroitic settlements reveal fortified walls, bastions, and defensive ditches, indicating a strategy of territorial control and protection of key economic and administrative centers. These defensive measures reflect an understanding of siege tactics, riverine approaches, and the need to secure trade corridors. Military installations often integrated storage facilities for weapons and provisions, demonstrating the logistical sophistication required to maintain prolonged deployments or defensive readiness. Weapons technology extended beyond bows and chariots. Excavated armaments include iron and bronze swords, spears, daggers, and axes, highlighting the integration of local metallurgical expertise with practical battlefield applications. Shields and protective gear, often constructed from leather, wood, and occasionally metal reinforcements, provided defensive resilience for infantry units. The combination of durable weapons, tactical formations, and coordinated leadership enabled Kushite forces to conduct both offensive campaigns and defensive operations with strategic effectiveness. Training and military hierarchy were closely tied to state administration. Royal inscriptions and reliefs depict the king in direct association with military operations, emphasizing both personal command and divine sanction. Officers likely oversaw regimental units, ensuring discipline, coordination, and adherence to tactical doctrine. This structured approach allowed the Kushite military to operate as an integrated instrument of state power, reinforcing political authority, safeguarding trade networks, and supporting territorial ambitions. Kushite archers were renowned throughout the ancient world for their precision. The kingdom's military organization combined specialized units, advanced weapons technology, and strategic fortifications to maintain security, project authority, and influence regional politics. Through disciplined infantry, highly trained archers, mobile cavalry, and the selective use of chariots, Kush developed a force capable of both defending its territory and engaging in broader interstate conflicts. This military capacity shaped Kush's relations with neighboring states, including Egypt, the Red Sea polities, and emerging powers in the eastern Mediterranean. During the 3rd to 1st centuries BCE, Kush engaged in a series of military and diplomatic confrontations with Ptolemaic Egypt, reflecting the kingdom's strategic determination to maintain autonomy along the Nile's southern corridor. Archaeological evidence, including fortified sites near the First Cataract and inscriptions from Meroe and Egyptian frontier towns, demonstrates that Kushite forces actively monitored and defended key border regions. Greco-Roman historians, such as Strabo and Diodorus Siculus, provide complementary accounts, noting that Kush maintained armed contingents and periodically launched raids into Egyptian territory when southern Ptolemaic control threatened local economic and political interests. Kushite strategy emphasized both defense and negotiation. Military engagements were often concentrated near strategic river crossings and trade routes, where Kushite forces could exploit knowledge of local terrain and mobility advantages. Egyptian sources describe the deployment of archers and infantry against Kushite incursions, suggesting that the kingdom could field coordinated, effective resistance despite the technological and logistical resources of the Ptolemaic state. Fortifications and garrison settlements along the frontier acted as deterrents, while Kushite diplomatic envoys engaged with Egyptian rulers to negotiate trade rights, tribute obligations, and territorial claims. The period also saw the intensification of cultural and economic exchanges alongside conflict. Kushite caravans continued to traverse trade routes into the delta, delivering gold, ivory, and exotic animals while importing Mediterranean goods, including pottery, wine, and textiles. This dual pattern of commerce and confrontation illustrates the kingdom's capacity to integrate military preparedness with economic strategy. The combination of armed defense and diplomatic negotiation allowed Kush to preserve independence while maintaining access to lucrative southern Egyptian markets. Classical sources describe episodes of Kushite aggression as both reactive and preemptive. Strabo notes that the Meroitic rulers sometimes conducted punitive expeditions to assert control over contested regions, projecting power without provoking full-scale Egyptian campaigns. Similarly, Egyptian records from the Ptolemaic period document Kushite raiders capturing prisoners and disrupting southern territories, emphasizing the kingdom's ability to influence regional dynamics despite the nominal superiority of its northern neighbor. These accounts, when compared with archaeological fortifications and material culture, suggest a deliberate and sustained approach to frontier security. As Ptolemaic Egypt sought southern control, Kush defended its borders with determination. The kingdom's military strategy combined fortification, tactical deployment of archers and infantry, and targeted raids, while diplomacy mediated the occasional stalemate or negotiated settlement. Kushite success in preserving territorial sovereignty over several centuries demonstrates the resilience of Meroe's administrative and military institutions. The most intense of these conflicts would occur under Roman rule, when the northern Mediterranean power projected military and political influence into the Nile Valley. The conflict between Kush and Rome from 25 to 21 BC represents one of the most prominent military episodes in the kingdom's later history. The war was precipitated by Rome's consolidation of Egypt following Augustus' annexation in 30 BCE, which placed imperial forces directly on Kush's northern frontier. Kushite responses, under the leadership of Candake Amanirenas, combined both military initiative and strategic acumen. Archaeological and textual evidence, including Roman accounts by Cassius Dio and Strabo, document Kushite attacks on frontier forts, the advance into Syene, modern Aswan, and the capture or destruction of Roman outposts along the First Cataract. These campaigns demonstrate the capability of the Kushite military to conduct offensive operations against a highly organized imperial army. Amanirena's role exemplifies the political and military authority exercised by Meroitic queens. Inscriptions and classical sources describe her as coordinating both battlefield strategy and diplomatic negotiation. Kushite forces utilized archers, infantry, and cavalry effectively in a combination of direct assaults and guerrilla-style raids, leveraging knowledge of the Nile corridor and surrounding desert terrain. The initial successes, including the temporary disruption of Roman control in southern Egypt, underscored the continued relevance of Kushite military organization centuries after the peak of Napatan power. The Roman response involved the deployment of legions under prefect Gaius Petronius, who conducted systematic campaigns to reassert imperial authority, fortifying key positions and engaging Kushite troops in the borderlands. Roman records emphasize that, despite logistical challenges and unfamiliar terrain, imperial forces managed to stabilize the frontier without complete conquest of Meroe. Archaeological evidence at Syene and other forts corroborates the disruption and rebuilding activities associated with this conflict, reflecting the intensity and strategic significance of the engagements. Diplomatic resolution followed military encounters, culminating in a peace treaty that delineated borders, established formal trade relations, and guaranteed Kushite autonomy. Roman sources acknowledge the settlement as favorable to Kush, indicating recognition of the kingdom's resilience and political standing. The treaty enabled the continuation of long-distance commerce, including gold, ivory, and other goods, while integrating Kush into a system of regulated interactions with the Roman Empire. This episode illustrates how military capacity, strategic leadership, and negotiation allowed a regional African power to maintain sovereignty in the face of a global empire. Amanirenas led one of the most formidable resistances Rome encountered in Africa. Through coordinated campaigns, tactical skill, and assertive diplomacy, Kush preserved its independence and secured recognition from one of history's largest empires. The conflict highlights the strategic integration of military organization, leadership, and negotiation in sustaining state power. Yet over the following centuries, internal and external pressures began to strain the state, setting the stage for gradual decline in both political cohesion and economic capacity. The decline of Kush was precipitated in large part by long-term environmental and economic pressures rather than sudden external conquest. Archaeological and paleo-environmental evidence indicates that from the 2nd century CE onward, the Nile floodplain experienced shifts in hydrology, including irregular inundations and alterations in river courses, which disrupted traditional irrigation systems and diminished soil fertility. Botanical and sediment analyses from Meroitic settlements reveal a reduction in cultivated cereal yields and pasture quality, limiting the capacity to sustain both urban populations and military garrisons. Simultaneously, the exhaustion of nearby iron ore deposits, which had underpinned Meroe's industrial and economic strength, contributed to declining technological productivity, particularly in weapon and tool manufacture. These environmental stresses were compounded by broader economic shifts. Long-distance trade, which had historically supplied gold, ivory, and other commodities to Mediterranean markets, became increasingly competitive as new trade routes and partners emerged. Roman and later Byzantine accounts indicate reduced Kushite participation in Red Sea commerce, suggesting that the kingdom's once dominant position in regional exchange networks was eroding. Archaeological evidence of abandoned warehouses, declining material quality, and reduced urban expansion points to a contraction of economic activity, which in turn weakened central authority and administrative cohesion. The combination of reduced agricultural output, resource depletion, and diminishing trade revenues placed immense strain on the state apparatus. Local governors and provincial officials faced challenges in maintaining tribute collection, enforcing taxation, and provisioning military units, leading to decreased central oversight. This fiscal stress, coupled with environmental unpredictability, created conditions in which both internal unrest and external opportunism could more readily threaten Kushite stability. Royal inscriptions from later periods reflect increasingly formulaic references to kingship, indicating a potential symbolic consolidation in the face of practical decline. Social and demographic impacts also followed from these economic and environmental pressures. Evidence from cemetery sites shows shifts in burial practices, reduced monumentality in pyramids, and decreased material investment in elite goods, signaling declining elite wealth and influence. Settlements became more dispersed, reflecting adjustments to the limitations of local resources and a possible migration away from areas with diminishing agricultural viability. These demographic patterns underscore the interdependence of environmental sustainability, economic capacity, and social organization in sustaining state power. Kush's decline began not with invasion, but with gradual environmental and economic strain. Hydrological changes, declining agricultural yields, and the depletion of iron resources eroded the foundation of political and economic authority, reducing the kingdom's capacity to maintain centralized control and project power. These systemic vulnerabilities demonstrate the critical role of ecological and economic factors in shaping the trajectory of ancient states. These vulnerabilities were compounded by rising competition from neighboring powers, including Aksum and later incursions from expanding Roman and Arabian interests, which would accelerate the political fragmentation and territorial contraction of Kush. During the 1st through 4th centuries CE, the kingdom of Kush faced mounting economic and geopolitical challenges from the rising power of Aksum in the Horn of Africa. Archaeological and epigraphic evidence demonstrates that Aksum capitalized on shifting trade routes across the Red Sea and the southern Arabian corridor, increasingly channeling goods that had formerly passed through Kushite intermediaries. Classical sources, including Roman and Greek accounts, note the expansion of maritime commerce linking the Red Sea, Indian Ocean, and Mediterranean markets. Items such as frankincense, myrrh, ivory, and exotic animals were rerouted through Aksumite ports, diminishing Kush's role in regional exchange and reducing its access to crucial luxury goods and revenue streams. Material evidence from Meroitic settlements reflects these economic shifts. Excavations reveal declining quantities of imported amphorae, Mediterranean ceramics, and luxury items, suggesting a contraction of Kush's trade networks. Simultaneously, Aksumite inscriptions and coinage indicate that this emerging kingdom had established both commercial and diplomatic connections with Mediterranean states, consolidating its position as a dominant regional hub. The loss of influence over Red Sea trade weakened Kush's ability to fund military operations, maintain administrative networks, and support urban centers, contributing to the broader structural decline of the Meroitic state. The rise of Aksum also altered the strategic balance along the Nile and adjacent highlands. Kushite authorities faced increasing competition for control of caravan routes and access to gold and ivory sources. Evidence from frontier forts and settlements suggests that the kingdom attempted to secure its borders and preserve trading corridors, but the combined pressures of environmental stress, resource depletion, and Aksumite competition limited effective intervention. Diplomatic exchanges, including potential negotiated agreements over trade rights, appear insufficient to offset the economic and political disadvantage. These developments demonstrate the interdependence of economic networks and geopolitical strength. As Kush became increasingly marginalized from long-distance trade, its capacity to project military power, sustain elite institutions, and maintain centralized governance eroded. The kingdom's diminished commercial influence illustrates how shifts in regional commerce directly affect political and territorial authority in pre-modern states. Material culture, including declining architectural investment and reduced craft production, corroborates this broader systemic contraction. As Aksum grew stronger, Kush found itself increasingly marginalized. The kingdom's economic foundations, previously supported by Nile-based and trans-African trade, were undermined by the reorientation of regional exchange networks toward emerging competitors. This economic marginalization, compounded by existing environmental and administrative challenges, set the stage for the final political collapse of Meroe. By the 4th century CE, internal decline culminated in the fall of Meroe, marking the end of the Kushite state as a centralized political entity and transitioning the region into a period of dispersed, successor communities. The final century of the Kushite state, roughly spanning the 3rd to 4th centuries CE, witnessed the culmination of long-term pressures that had been building for centuries. Archaeological evidence from Meroe, including abandoned settlements, decaying pyramids, and the cessation of large-scale craft production, indicates a progressive collapse of political and economic infrastructure. Excavations show that administrative centers were no longer maintained, and temples were neglected, suggesting both fiscal strain and declining centralized authority. Material culture reveals a reduction in imported goods, diminished construction of monumental architecture, and simplified elite burial practices, reflecting the broader contraction of state power. Historians and archaeologists debate the primary causes of Meroe's fall. One prominent theory emphasizes the role of external aggression, particularly an invasion by the rising kingdom of Aksum. Aksumite inscriptions and accounts in Ethiopian chronicles describe campaigns into the southern Nile Valley, suggesting that military pressure may have directly contributed to the abandonment of Meroe. Alternative explanations highlight internal factors, including political fragmentation among regional elites, fiscal exhaustion due to declining trade revenues, and environmental degradation that undermined agriculture and iron production. The archaeological record supports a model of complex, multi-causal decline, where both internal weaknesses and external threats interacted over decades. Economic exhaustion played a critical role in weakening the state's capacity to respond to external challenges. The loss of control over Trans-African and Red Sea trade networks, combined with reduced gold production and declining urban management, limited the resources available for defense and governance. Evidence from storage facilities, workshops, and settlement patterns indicates that production of luxury and utilitarian goods had contracted significantly by the 3rd century CE. This economic contraction would have constrained royal authority, reduced military readiness, and undermined the state's administrative cohesion. Political fragmentation further accelerated decline. Inscriptions and tomb evidence suggest that local governors and elites increasingly operated with relative autonomy, diminishing the influence of the central authority based at Meroe. This decentralization disrupted coordinated defense strategies and weakened the enforcement of trade monopolies and tribute collection. Without robust central governance, the kingdom became vulnerable to both internal dissent and external incursions, creating conditions favorable to territorial loss and institutional collapse. The end of Meroe marked the conclusion of one of Africa's longest-lived civilizations. Despite centuries of cultural, political, and economic achievement, the convergence of environmental stress, economic contraction, internal fragmentation, and external pressures culminated in the kingdom's abandonment. Archaeological evidence, including the final cessation of pyramid construction, the decay of urban centers, and the reduction of elite tombs, attests to a systematic, if gradual, decline rather than abrupt destruction alone. Although the kingdom fell, its cultural influence continued long afterward. Meroitic artistic styles, religious traditions, and linguistic forms persisted in successor communities, shaping regional practices in Nubia and beyond. The legacy of Kushite governance, trade networks, and cultural syncretism endured in the Nile Valley, leaving an imprint on subsequent African civilizations and serving as a testament to the historical significance of this enduring African state. Modern understanding of the Kingdom of Kush owes much to systematic archaeological investigation beginning in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Pioneering work by George Reisner at Meroe and Apeta documented pyramids, temples, and burial sites with unprecedented precision, establishing foundational chronologies for Meroitic and Napatan phases. Reisner's excavations, while methodologically limited by contemporary standards, provided detailed plans, artifact catalogs, and epigraphic records that remain central to Kushite studies. Subsequent fieldwork by Griffith, Bonnet, and other European archaeologists expanded knowledge of material culture, including ceramics, metalwork, and royal iconography, linking architectural and funerary traditions to political and religious structures. Modern Sudanese archaeologists have built upon these foundations, employing advanced methods such as radiocarbon dating, stratigraphic analysis, and GIS-based site mapping. Radiocarbon assays have refined timelines for pyramid construction, temple use, and urban expansion, resolving debates over Napatan versus Meroitic phases. Epigraphic studies of inscriptions in both Egyptian and Meroitic scripts have clarified royal genealogies, administrative structures, and religious practices, while the gradual decipherment of the Meroitic script continues to yield insights into governance, economy, and social organization. Excavations at sites like Musaweret es Sufra, Naka, and Sanam provide evidence of regional variation in architecture, fortifications, and ceremonial landscapes, emphasizing the complexity of Kushite polity and culture. Historiographical debates have shaped the interpretation of these findings. Early European scholars often viewed Nubian states through a lens of external comparison, emphasizing Egyptian influence and minimizing indigenous innovation. Contemporary research increasingly foregrounds Kushite agency, recognizing the kingdom's independent political institutions, technological achievements, and cultural synthesis. Archaeological data demonstrate that Kush integrated, adapted, and sometimes resisted Egyptian models, producing a unique civilization with long-term regional impact. Studies of trade networks, metallurgical production, and settlement patterns reveal the kingdom's capacity for economic organization and regional diplomacy, challenging earlier notions of peripheral status. Modern archaeology has revealed the depth and complexity of Kushite civilization. By combining field excavation, laboratory analysis, and comparative historical study, researchers have reconstructed the political, economic, and religious structures of a kingdom that thrived for over a millennium. Material culture, textual evidence, and environmental data collectively illustrate how geography, resources, and strategic governance shaped a state capable of sustained influence across northeastern Africa. These discoveries have also reshaped modern interpretations of African antiquity. The study of Kush demonstrates that sophisticated political and cultural systems existed independently south of Egypt, challenging earlier Eurocentric narratives and emphasizing the Nile Valley's role as a locus of innovation and state formation. By tracing the trajectory of Kush from its environmental foundations through imperial expansion, economic transformation, and eventual decline, archaeology and modern scholarship highlight the enduring legacy of one of Africa's most remarkable civilizations. The Kingdom of Kush continues to exert a profound influence on modern Sudanese cultural identity and the broader historiography of Africa. Archaeological, artistic, and textual records of Kushite civilization provide a tangible link to a pre-colonial past characterized by state formation, economic sophistication, and cultural innovation. In contemporary Sudan, monuments such as the pyramids at Meroe, the temples of Napata, and the sacred landscape of Jebel Barkal function not only as historical sites but also as symbols of national heritage. Educational curricula, museum collections, and public commemorations frequently reference Kush as a source of historical continuity, emphasizing the region's long-standing engagement with political authority, religious practices, and artistic production. Kushite achievements in governance, urban planning, and economic integration resonate in modern understandings of African statecraft. Scholars highlight the kingdom's administrative innovations, including complex provincial oversight, taxation systems, and trade regulation, as examples of indigenous institutional capacity. The prominence of queens or kandakes and the integration of religious and political authority illustrate the kingdom's unique social structures. These features are increasingly incorporated into Africanist narratives that seek to situate sub-Saharan civilizations as active participants in early global history, rather than peripheral actors. Artistic and cultural expressions from Kush also influence modern interpretations of African art history. The Meroitic pyramids, temple reliefs, and statuary demonstrate sophisticated iconography blending Egyptian, Nubian, and local styles, providing a precedent for understanding regional creativity and adaptation. Scholars and curators emphasize how these artifacts reflect long-term cultural resilience, highlighting continuity of religious motifs, symbolic representation, and craftsmanship across centuries. In Sudanese cultural discourse, these expressions serve as points of reference for identity formation, offering visual and material connections to an indigenous African state capable of both local governance and transcontinental engagement. Kush's economic and diplomatic networks further enhance its historical significance. Trade routes linking the Nile Valley, Central Africa, the Red Sea, and the Mediterranean illustrate the kingdom's role in early long-distance exchange, contributing to comparative studies of pre-modern economies. By demonstrating how a Nubian polity integrated environmental adaptation, resource management, and political coordination, Kush provides an empirical model for understanding the mechanisms of state durability and regional influence. These historical insights inform both Sudanese national narratives and wider discussions of African civilizations in global history. Kush also occupies a central place in the historiography of African antiquity. Colonial-era scholarship often downplayed the achievements of Nubian kingdoms, framing them as derivative of Egyptian models. Contemporary research, informed by archaeology, epigraphy, and environmental studies, emphasizes Kushite agency, demonstrating independent political, technological, and cultural development. This reevaluation supports the inclusion of Kush within broader discourses on early state formation, literacy, religious innovation, and economic integration across Africa, challenging prior Eurocentric assumptions and highlighting the kingdom's contribution to the diversity of ancient civilizations. Kush remains a central symbol of historical continuity in the Sudanese cultural landscape. Its monuments, material culture, and documented political and religious systems offer modern Sudanese society a concrete connection to a legacy of governance, cultural creativity, and regional influence. The study of Kush illustrates the enduring capacity of African polities to shape their environment, negotiate with neighboring powers, and sustain complex social structures over extended periods. The kingdom's influence extends beyond national identity, contributing to continental and global understandings of historical development. In Africanist scholarship, Kush exemplifies the capacity for political centralization, economic adaptation, and cultural resilience south of the Nile, reinforcing the importance of integrating sub-Saharan histories into comparative studies of early states. Artistic and architectural forms, religious traditions, and linguistic innovations from Meroe and Napata continue to inform analyses of regional interaction, cultural exchange, and adaptation in antiquity. Thus, the legacy of Kush endures in both scholarship and cultural memory. Its historical trajectory, from environmental foundations and early state formation to imperial expansion, economic innovation, and eventual decline, remains a critical case study for understanding African history, pre-modern statecraft, and the transmission of culture. By preserving and interpreting these achievements, modern Sudanese society and global scholarship alike maintain an ongoing engagement with one of Africa's most enduring civilizations. If you found this exploration of Kush enlightening, subscribe to Nightfall History for more in-depth journeys through the rise, peak, and legacy of the world's great civilizations. Explore the full stories behind empires, kingdoms, and cultures with meticulous research, archaeological insight, and chronologically precise narratives. Turn on notifications to never miss a deep dive into history, and share this video to help others discover the remarkable story of Kush.